In a modest home on the edge of Stettin, where the wide waters of the Oder met the gray Baltic, a small boy sat at a wooden table, pencil moving carefully across paper as he drew straight lines that became towers, bridges, and halls that seemed to reach beyond the walls of his room. Those lines were more than play. They were his way of making sense of a world that felt broken. Hans Kammler grew up in a port city still carrying the weight of empire, but by the time he could form clear memories, that empire had already cracked and fallen. The streets outside held the quiet evidence of what defeat had done. Men returned from the front with eyes that had seen too much, their uniforms traded for worn coats, their stories told in fragments around kitchen tables. Families like the Kammlers gathered in the evenings not to celebrate victory, but to measure what remained. A father's steady hands, a mother's careful budgeting, the small rituals that kept the household standing when the larger world had been told it must kneel. Young Hans watched all of it. He was not the loudest child in any room, but he noticed the spaces between things. The way a cracked wall still held a roof. The way a bridge could carry weight even after bombs had fallen nearby. While other boys played at soldiers with sticks, he arranged blocks into careful patterns, then took them apart and started again, always searching for a stronger shape. It was not yet ambition in the way adults would later understand it. It was something simpler and more stubborn, the need to create order where none seemed to exist. His parents saw it early. His father, a man who had known the old Germany and now navigated the new one with quiet determination, would sometimes sit beside him and ask what the drawing meant. Hans would point to a line and say it would hold. The answer always came with certainty, as if the paper itself could be made real if only he measured carefully enough. His mother kept those first sketches in a drawer, not because she believed they were remarkable, but because they were proof that her son still believed something lasting could be built. In a time when so many things felt temporary, that belief mattered more than anyone could say out loud. The war had ended before Hans was old enough to understand its battles, but its consequences arrived in every season. Food appeared in smaller portions. Coal for the stove became something to be rationed and stretched. Neighbors spoke in lowered voices about the terms that had been forced upon their country, about land taken, pride stripped, futures narrowed. A child hears these things even when adults think they are speaking only to each other. Hans heard the frustration, the confusion, the slow hardening of voices that once spoke of duty and now spoke of survival. He did not yet have words for what he felt, but he carried it in the way he drew his line straighter, and the way he began to ask questions about how things were made and why they sometimes fell apart. School became another kind of construction site. Teachers spoke of Germany's past glories and its present difficulties, and Hans listened with the same focused attention he gave to his drawings. He was not drawn to speeches or parades. He was drawn to the problems that could be solved with calculation and care. When a mathematics lesson turned to the strength of materials or the flow of water through channels, something in him sharpened. Here was a language that did not depend on who had won or lost. It depended on whether the numbers held. In those hours, the larger chaos of the streets and the newspapers seemed to recede. A boy could lose himself in the certainty of an equation the way another might lose himself in a game. Yet the world outside the classroom kept pressing in. Inflation turned money into something that lost value between one day and the next. Families who had once felt secure found themselves counting coins for bread. Hans saw his own parents make small, private sacrifices so that his schooling could continue. There were no grand declarations in the Kammler house about destiny or revenge. There was only the steady work of keeping his son's future possible. That quiet endurance left its mark. He learned early that building anything worthwhile required patience with the unseen costs, with the hours no one applauded, with the decisions made not for glory but for the next day's stability. By the time he was old enough to leave home for further study, the boy who had sketched towers had become a young man who understood that engineering was never only about stone and steel. It was about people who needed places to live, work, and move through their lives without fear of collapse. He carried that understanding with him when he traveled to continue his education. The journey itself felt like a crossing. Behind him lay the familiar streets of Stettin and the unspoken weight of a nation still learning how to stand again. Ahead lay lecture halls, new cities, and the chance to turn private drawings into something others would trust with their weight. In those university years, the personal and the national continued to braid together in ways he did not yet fully see. Classmates arrived with their own stories of fathers who had not come home, of towns that had changed names on maps, of futures that had been redrawn without their consent. They studied the same principles of structure and force, yet each brought a different hunger to the work. For Hans, the hunger was for precision that could not be argued with. He spent long nights checking calculations twice, then a third time, not because anyone demanded it, but because a mistake in a drawing could become a failure in the real world. That discipline was already becoming part of who he was. It felt like protection against the uncertainty that had surrounded his childhood. There were moments of ordinary grace amid the seriousness. A professor who noticed his careful work and offered a word of encouragement that stayed with him for weeks. A late-night conversation with a fellow student about what they hoped to build one day, not in grand terms, but in the simple language of useful things, a hospital wing that would not crack, a railway station that would welcome travelers safely, a home that would still stand for the children who had not yet been born. These were not political conversations. They were the conversations of young men trying to imagine a future they could shape with their own hands. Yet even in those hopeful exchanges, the shadow of what Germany had lost remained present. It appeared in the way some professors spoke of past achievements with a careful pride that avoided boasting. It appeared in the way students sometimes fell silent when the conversation turned to the treaties that still shaped their daily lives. Hans listened to all of it. He did not argue. He filed it away with the same care he gave to his notes. The nation's defeat had not broken his belief that building mattered. If anything, it had sharpened that belief into something closer to necessity. If the larger structures of politics and power could fail so completely, then perhaps the answer lay in the smaller, more honest work of making things that held. He did not yet know where that conviction would lead him. He only knew that when he looked at a blank page or an empty stretch of ground, he felt the same pull he had felt as a boy, the desire to leave something standing that had not been there before. That desire was still innocent in its own way. It belonged to the part of him that had grown up measuring the distance between what was broken and what could be repaired. It belonged to the part that had watched his parents keep a household together through years when many others could not. It belonged to the part that still believed skill and care could be enough. And perhaps that is where the story of any life begins to turn, not in a single dramatic choice, but in the slow accumulation of small certainties. The boy who drew towers in a defeated port city had become a young man who trusted in the language of structure. He trusted it more than he trusted the words of politicians or the promises of crowds. That trust would carry him forward into rooms and decisions he could not yet imagine. But for now, in the quiet hours of study and the ordinary moments of walking between lectures, it was simply the thing that gave his days shape. If these early chapters of a life shaped by national defeat and private determination have stirred something in you, if you find yourself wanting to hold onto a tangible connection with the personal histories of that era, you might discover real value in exploring World War II memorabilia that lets you touch pieces of the past, or in settling in with a film like Midway on Prime that brings the human courage and sacrifice of those years to the screen in such a powerful way. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. What stayed with Hans through those formative years was not a hunger for power, but a quieter conviction that the world could be made more solid if someone cared enough to measure twice and build once. That conviction would travel with him into the next chapters of his story. It would be tested in ways no young engineer from Stettin could have foreseen. And it would eventually ask questions that no drawing on paper could ever answer. But the foundation had already been laid in those early years, and the careful lines a boy drew while a nation learned how to stand again. In a modest apartment where the winter light barely reached the table, a young engineer named Hans Kammler sat with a single sheet of paper in front of him, the pen resting between his fingers as if the weight of the decision had already settled into his hand. He had spent the morning at his drafting table, checking measurements twice the way he always did, because even the smallest error in a line could become a failure later. Outside, the streets of Germany in the early 1930s carried the sound of uncertainty. Shops opened late and closed early. Men stood in lines that seemed to grow longer each week. Arguments broke out in cafes over who was to blame for the hunger and the fear, and then faded into the same tired silence that followed every argument. Hans had learned to move through that silence without drawing attention to himself. He preferred the clean certainty of his drawings to the messy arguments of politics. Yet politics had a way of finding even the quietest men. He had joined the Nazi Party the year before, not in a moment of sudden passion, but after weeks of watching colleagues and neighbors make the same choice. Some spoke of it openly at work, saying the party understood the need for order, for discipline, for someone to finally take control of a country that felt like it was sliding apart. Others joined quietly, the way Hans had, filling out forms in the evening when no one was watching. There was no torchlight parade in his memory of that day. Only the practical relief of believing that a man with technical skills might finally be valued for something more than surviving another month of inflation and unemployment. His wife Yuta moved through the small rooms behind him, preparing what passed for an evening meal in those years. She did not ask about the paper on the table. She had learned, as many wives had, that some decisions were best left to the quiet calculations of the men who carried the weight of providing. Hans appreciated that silence. It gave him space to think without having to explain the mixture of hope and caution that had brought him to this point. He had seen what happened to engineers who stayed on the outside. They watched contracts go to others, promotions pass them by, and the quiet judgment of superiors who had already chosen their side. Joining had felt less like an act of conviction and more like an act of self-preservation dressed in the language of national renewal. What drew him most was not the speeches or the uniforms. It was the promise, repeated in pamphlets and conversations, that Germany needed men who could build. Not just buildings, but systems. Orderly systems that would not collapse the way the old republic had collapsed. Hans had grown up watching a nation try to stand on broken promises and shifting ground. He had seen his own parents stretch every mark and every meal. The idea that someone, somewhere, was finally drawing straight lines again appealed to the part of him that had always preferred precision over passion. When he read the party materials, he did not linger on the fiery language about enemies or destiny. He lingered on the sections that spoke of reconstruction, of efficiency, of putting technical minds in charge of practical problems. Those words felt like they had been written for someone like him. There were nights when the calculation felt heavier. He would sit after Yuta had gone to bed and wonder whether the men at the top truly understood the difference between a strong state and a cruel one. He had no illusions about street violence or the rougher elements that sometimes marched under the same banners. Yet he told himself those were temporary excesses, the price of restoring discipline after years of chaos. Other parties had failed to deliver anything but more speeches and more lines at the soup kitchens. This one, at least, seemed willing to act. And action, for an engineer, was always preferable to paralysis. His early work had already shown him how much a single competent person could accomplish when given clear authority and clear goals. In the civil service roles he had held, he had watched projects stall because too many voices argued and too few decisions were made. The party promised an end to that paralysis. It promised that men who delivered results would be noticed and advanced. For someone who had spent his youth measuring the distance between what Germany claimed to be and what it actually was, that promise carried real weight. It was not about hatred. It was about competence finally matching again. Still, the step into the SS felt different from the first party membership. The SS carried a sharper edge. It was not merely a political organization, it was an elite within the movement, a place where discipline was not just encouraged but required. When the opportunity came to transfer his skills into that structure, Hans weighed it with the same care he gave to any blueprint. The SS needed engineers who could organize construction on a large scale. It needed men who understood how to turn plans into finished work without waste or delay. His reputation for precision had already traveled ahead of him in small ways. Colleagues spoke well of his reliability. Superiors noted that he did not waste time on complaints or excuses. Those quiet endorsements mattered more to him than any rally or headline. The day he made the decision, there was no ceremony. He filled out another form, this one carrying the weight of a different kind of commitment. He did not feel like a man stepping into darkness. He felt like a man stepping into a room where the lights had finally been turned on and someone was finally drawing the plans with a steady hand. The uniform would come later. The rank would come later. What mattered in that moment was the sense that his particular talents had found a place where they would be used rather than ignored. Yuta noticed a change in him over the following weeks, though she said little about it. He stood a little straighter when he left for work. He spoke less about the daily frustrations of bureaucracy and more about the satisfaction of seeing projects move forward under clearer direction. There were still moments of private doubt, especially when stories reached him of neighbors who had been questioned or colleagues who had quietly disappeared from certain circles. Hans told himself those were necessary corrections, the price of removing the elements that had weakened Germany for so long. He did not dwell on the human details behind those corrections. He focused instead on the larger picture of a nation being rebuilt by people who understood structure. What he could not yet see, and perhaps did not yet want to see, was how completely that desire for order could be turned into something else entirely. The same precision that made him valuable to the SS would later be applied to projects whose true purpose was never shown on the clean blueprints he preferred. But in these early years, the seduction was still gentle. It came in the form of steady work, of recognition for skills that had once seemed ordinary, of belonging to an organization that treated technical competence as a form of loyalty. It came in the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent his childhood watching a country stumble and had now found a place where stumbling was no longer tolerated. He did not join because he dreamed of conquest. He joined because he dreamed of things that did not fall apart. And in a Germany that had known too much falling apart, that dream felt like the most reasonable choice a practical man could make. If the quiet calculations of men like Hans, the small personal decisions that felt like survival rather than ideology, have left you wanting to see what those years actually looked like beyond the official photographs and carefully worded histories, there are collections of raw, uncensored images and footage from that time that show the harsh realities the cameras of the era often left out. You can find them through a secure digital product made available for those who want the unfiltered visual record. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. What stayed with Hans in those first months inside the SS was not a sense of having crossed some irreversible line, but the simpler feeling that his work now had direction. The drafting table still waited for him each morning. The measurements still needed to be checked. Only now the lines he drew existed within a larger structure that promised they would actually be built. That promise was enough to quiet most doubts. It would take years, and choices he could not yet imagine, before he would have to ask himself what price that promise had carried all along. For now, the order he had sought had found him, and he had chosen to serve it with the same steady attention he had once given to a boyhood sketch of towers that refused to fall. In the disciplined corridors where loyalty was measured in results rather than words, a young engineer named Hans Kammler discovered that the straightest path upward ran through an unblinking willingness to deliver exactly what the system asked for, no matter how the shadows lengthened around the edges of those requests. He had already taken the first calculated steps into the SS, and those steps had brought him into a world that rewarded precision the way other places rewarded charm or connections. The early assignments were modest at first. He was given small organizational tasks, the kind of work that tested whether a man could turn vague orders into finished outcomes without constant supervision. Hans approached each one the way he had once approached a set of blueprints. He measured the requirements, identified the obstacles, and removed anything that slowed progress. Colleagues who worked beside him noticed how little he complained about the long hours or the shifting expectations. He simply adjusted his calculations and kept moving. That quiet reliability began to travel ahead of him in the way small reputations do inside large organizations. What struck those who observed him was not any dramatic display of ambition. It was the absence of hesitation. When a superior gave him a task that required cutting through layers of bureaucracy or pushing subordinates harder than they expected, Hans did not pause to weigh the human friction. He saw only the gap between what had been asked and what had been delivered, and he closed that gap. In the SS culture of the mid-1930s, that quality stood out. The organization was still growing, still shaping itself around the idea that discipline and efficiency could solve problems that politics and debate had failed to solve. Men who could translate that idea into concrete results found doors opening more quickly than they might have in the old civil service. At home, the changes appeared in smaller ways. Yuta noticed that her husband returned later in the evenings and spoke less about the details of his day. When he did speak, it was often about the satisfaction of seeing a plan move from paper to reality without the endless delays he had once accepted as normal. There was pride in his voice, the kind of pride that comes from knowing your particular skills have finally found a place where they are not only valued but actively sought. The children were still young, and the household rhythms adjusted around his new demands without open complaint. Yuta managed the quiet domestic side of their life with the same steady competence he brought to his work. She did not press him for explanations he seemed unwilling to give. In many German homes of that era, wives learned to read the silences that accompanied their husband's advancement inside the new structures of power. Inside the SS, advancement came through a mixture of visible results and invisible alignment. Hans excelled at both. He completed projects on time and under the expectations set for him. He also absorbed the language and posture of the organization without resistance. When conversations turned to the need for a stronger Germany or the removal of elements that weakened the national body, he listened with the same focused attention he gave to technical briefings. He did not argue or embellish. He simply absorbed and applied. Superiors noticed that he did not require ideological lectures to understand what was expected. He understood instinctively that loyalty was demonstrated through performance, not through passionate speeches. There were moments when the human texture of the work brushed against him in ways that could not be entirely ignored. He oversaw small teams on construction-related tasks, and sometimes those teams included men whose backgrounds or attitudes did not perfectly match the new ideal. When orders came down to reassign or sideline certain individuals, Hans carried them out with the same efficiency he brought to every other directive. He did not linger over the personal stories of those who were moved aside. He focused on the improved output that followed. Yet in quieter hours, perhaps while reviewing reports at his desk or walking home through darkening streets, he must have felt the weight of those decisions settling somewhere inside him. The weight did not slow his progress. If anything, it sharpened his focus on the next task, the next measurable improvement. The SS rewarded that focus. As the organization expanded its reach into economic and administrative spheres, men who could organize large-scale efforts with minimal waste rose faster than those who relied on connections or charisma. Hans fit the emerging profile perfectly. He possessed the technical training that was increasingly valued, and he possessed the temperament that treated human complications as obstacles to be managed rather than reasons to hesitate. When opportunities for greater responsibility appeared, he was already positioned to take them. Each new role brought him into closer contact with the inner workings of the system. He saw how decisions made at higher levels translated into instructions that reached the ground, and he learned how to make those instructions produce the outcomes that were desired. What grew inside him during these years was not simply ambition in the ordinary sense. It was a deepening confidence that the structures he served were capable of achieving what weaker systems had failed to achieve. He watched as the SS consolidated authority over areas that had once been tangled in competing bureaucracies. He saw projects that had stalled for years suddenly move forward once clear lines of command were established. That visible progress confirmed something he had believed since his youth, that order, properly applied, could overcome almost any obstacle. The fact that this order sometimes required harsh measures did not trouble him as much as it might have troubled a different kind of man. He measured success by what was built and what was accomplished, not by the quiet human costs that accumulated along the way. There were small moments of recognition that reinforced his path. A word of approval from a superior after a difficult project was completed. An assignment that carried more authority than the last. These moments arrived without fanfare, yet they carried weight inside an organization where praise was rare and advancement was the real currency. Hans accepted them with the same measured response he gave to everything else. He did not celebrate openly. He simply incorporated the new responsibility into his calculations and continued forward. The satisfaction he felt was private, a quiet confirmation that his particular combination of skills and temperament had found its proper setting. At home, the family absorbed the rhythm of his rising position without dramatic upheaval. Yuta maintained the household with the same quiet resilience she had shown through earlier years of uncertainty. She understood that her husband's work now existed inside a larger machine whose demands could not be negotiated. Their conversations in the evenings sometimes touched on practical matters of scheduling or resources, but rarely on the deeper nature of what he was helping to construct. That boundary was respected by both of them. It allowed the household to remain a place of ordinary domestic order even as the world outside grew more sharply defined by ideology and hierarchy. What Hans carried with him through these years of steady ascent was the growing conviction that competence was its own form of virtue. He had seen too many years of drift and argument in Germany's recent past. He had watched capable people waste their talents inside systems that rewarded talk over results. The SS offered something different. It offered a structure in which a man who could deliver was given the tools and the authority to deliver more. That bargain felt fair to him. It felt like the natural extension of the engineering mindset he had carried since boyhood: identify the problem, design the solution, execute without distraction. The shadows that accompanied this rise were real, even if he did not yet name them. They appeared in the stories of families disrupted by reassignments, and the quiet fear that passed through rooms when certain names were mentioned, and the growing distance between what was said in official language and what was understood in private. Hans navigated those shadows by focusing on the light of measurable progress. As long as the projects moved forward and the results met expectations, the surrounding atmosphere could be treated as background rather than foreground. That ability to compartmentalize would serve him well in the years ahead, though it would also exact its own quiet price on the man who practiced it. By the time his responsibilities expanded further, he had already internalized the lesson that the SS valued most: loyalty expressed through results was the surest path to influence. He had risen not by standing out in dramatic ways, but by making himself indispensable in the quiet, technical work that larger ambitions required. The steel of the organization had found a willing instrument in his precision. The shadows that would later define his legacy were still forming around the edges of that useful competence. If the story of how one man's steady, calculated rise inside a system of growing power has reminded you of the quiet dedication it takes to uncover these hidden chapters of history, then you understand why these narratives require so much careful research and time. If you found value in the way we bring these human stories to light, a small tip, even as little as $1, through Ko-Fi helps keep this work going and supports the effort to preserve these complex truths for those who want to understand them fully. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. What remained with Hans as he moved deeper into the ranks was the sense that he had finally found the environment where his particular strengths were not merely tolerated but actively required. The boy who had once drawn careful lines on paper had become a man whose lines now shaped real outcomes inside an organization that prized outcomes above almost everything else. That alignment felt, in those years, like the most natural and satisfying development his life could have taken. The cost of that satisfaction would reveal itself only later, when the projects he helped organize began to carry consequences far heavier than any blueprint could contain. For now, the rise continued, steady and untroubled by the shadows that gathered just beyond the edge of his focused attention. When the order arrived, it came not as a thunderclap but as another set of instructions on a desk already crowded with blueprints, and the engineer who received it read it with the same steady attention he had always given to any problem that required turning intention into finished structure. Hans Kammler had risen through the SS by proving he could make systems work. He had shown superiors that when he was given a task, the outcome matched the plan. Now the task before him carried a different weight. The instructions called for the rapid expansion of a camp near the Polish town of Auschwitz into something far larger and more specialized than anything he had overseen before. It was to become a place capable of holding and processing enormous numbers of people, with facilities designed for efficiency at every stage. The language in the documents was bureaucratic and precise. It spoke of construction measures, of special buildings, of the need to complete the work with urgency. It did not dwell on what those buildings would ultimately contain. That silence was part of the order itself. Kammler studied the requirements the way he had once studied load-bearing calculations. He saw the scale immediately. This was not a simple barracks expansion or a new administrative block. This was an entire complex that would need to function like a machine, with flows of people, materials, and processes moving in coordinated sequence. The challenge appealed to the part of him that had always preferred clear problems and measurable solutions. He began making notes in the margins, sketching preliminary layouts, identifying where existing structures could be adapted and where entirely new ones would have to rise. The work would demand speed. It would demand the use of forced labor already available in the camp system. It would demand that he coordinate with others who understood the ultimate purpose even if they rarely spoke it aloud in his presence. In the quiet of his office, he felt the familiar mixture of professional satisfaction and private calculation. This assignment marked another step upward. It came from the highest levels and carried the expectation that he would deliver without hesitation or waste. He had learned by now that hesitation was the one quality the SS could not afford in its technical specialists. Results mattered more than reflection. He told himself that the larger strategic needs of the Reich justified whatever measures were required. The same logic that had once explained the removal of obstacles in smaller projects now explained the necessity of building on this scale. He did not linger on the human reality behind the numbers in the documents. He focused instead on the engineering problem, how to create capacity, how to manage throughput, how to ensure the structures would endure the demands placed upon them. Yet even a man trained to see only the lines on paper could not entirely escape the atmosphere that surrounded this particular project. When he visited the site in those early planning stages, the air itself seemed different from other construction zones he had known. There was the usual noise of hammering and earth moving, but beneath it ran a current of something heavier. Prisoners in striped uniforms moved under guard, their faces hollowed by hunger and exhaustion. Some worked with the mechanical repetition of people who had already accepted that resistance only brought worse suffering. Others glanced up with eyes that still held a flicker of something uncrushed. Kammler walked among them with the same purposeful stride he used in any project inspection. He asked questions about progress, noted delays, issued corrections. He did not stop to speak with the prisoners or to learn their names. That was not his role. His role was to ensure the buildings rose according to the specifications he had been given. Still, there were moments when the human texture pressed closer than he might have preferred. He heard reports from subordinates about the condition of the workforce, about the need for more laborers because so many were weakening under the pace. He heard, without asking for details, that selections were being made among new arrivals, that those deemed unfit for work were being removed from the labor pool. The information arrived in the same clipped, professional language used for any supply or personnel issue. Kammler absorbed it and adjusted his timelines accordingly. He understood that the system was designed to extract maximum output from the available human material. That understanding allowed him to continue treating the project as an engineering challenge rather than a moral one. At home, the contrast was stark and unspoken. Yuta maintained the routines of family life with the same quiet competence she had always shown. The children played and studied and asked ordinary questions about their father's work. Kammler returned to that world each evening carrying the weight of what he had seen and planned during the day, yet he rarely brought any of it across the threshold. He spoke instead of schedules met and difficulties overcome. Yuta listened without pressing for more. She had learned that some parts of his life were best left unexamined if the household was to remain a place of ordinary order. In the evenings, when the children were asleep, there were sometimes long silences between them. Kammler would sit with reports or sketches spread before him, his mind still tracing the lines of the camp that was taking shape hundreds of kilometers away. Yuta would watch him without speaking, perhaps sensing the distance that had grown between the man who left each morning and the man who returned. The construction itself became a study in organized brutality. Prisoners were forced to build the very structures that would later be used to hold and destroy others like themselves. Barracks rose quickly because the labor was expendable and the pressure was constant. Kammler reviewed progress reports with a critical eye, noting where corners had been cut and where standards had slipped. He demanded improvements not out of any concern for those who would live inside the buildings, but because a structure that failed its purpose would reflect poorly on the man responsible for delivering it. Efficiency was the only metric that mattered. When a section of wall collapsed or a foundation proved unstable, he wanted to know why and how it would be prevented in the future. The human cost of those failures was measured only in lost time and wasted material. There were engineers and foremen working under him who sometimes hesitated when the orders grew more specific. One subordinate, a man who had joined the SS with similar hopes of professional advancement, once asked quietly whether the design changes they were being asked to implement served any purpose beyond increasing the speed at which people could be processed. Kammler looked at him for a long moment before answering. He spoke of the necessity of meeting targets, of the importance of not questioning the strategic vision of those above them. The subordinate nodded and returned to his work. The conversation was never repeated. Both men understood that such questions, once voiced, could not be taken back. The system had little tolerance for those who paused to consider the destination of the machine they were helping to build. Kammler himself felt no such pause. The part of him that had always sought order now saw in this project the ultimate expression of that drive. A camp that could receive, sort, house, and ultimately dispose of human beings on an industrial scale represented the logical endpoint of everything he had been trained to value: clear lines of authority, measurable outputs, structures that functioned without waste or sentiment. He did not need to be told the full purpose in graphic terms. The blueprints spoke for themselves. The gas chambers and crematoria were described in the same neutral language used for any other facility. They were simply another set of buildings that required proper ventilation, proper drainage, proper capacity. He approved the designs and pushed for their rapid completion because that was what the order demanded and what his own sense of professional duty required. The human stories unfolding around him were harder to ignore once the machine began to operate. Trains arrived carrying people who had been told they were being resettled. They were met by guards who moved them through selections with practiced speed. Families were separated in moments. Those chosen for work were marched toward the barracks Kammler had helped design. Those chosen for immediate death were sent toward the buildings whose purpose was never stated openly but was understood by everyone who worked there. Kammler received reports on throughput and capacity. He noted where bottlenecks occurred and issued instructions to smooth the flow. He did not visit the gas chambers or the crematoria himself. His role remained that of the engineer who ensured the infrastructure supported the process. Yet he knew, as every person involved in the project knew, what was happening inside those structures. The knowledge sat alongside his professional satisfaction like a shadow that never quite left the edge of his vision. There were rare moments when the weight of that knowledge pressed closer. Late at night, reviewing the day's reports, he might pause over a figure that represented not materials or hours but human lives processed through the system he had helped create. In those moments he reminded himself of the larger war, of the enemies who threatened Germany, of the necessity of total commitment. The rationalization worked because it had worked for so many others before him. It allowed him to return to his calculations the next morning with the same focused attention. The machine continued to grow because men like Kammler continued to treat it as a problem of engineering rather than a crime against humanity. What emerged from those months was not merely a larger camp but a new model of industrialized killing. The lessons learned in the design and operation of Auschwitz-Birkenau would influence other sites. The emphasis on speed, on minimal waste, on structures that could handle volume without breaking down became the standard. Kammler had delivered what was asked of him. He had turned an order into a functioning system. The pride he felt in that delivery was real, even if it existed alongside the knowledge of what the system was designed to do. That combination of pride and knowledge would travel with him into every subsequent assignment. It would shape the way he approached the next great engineering challenge the SS placed before him. If the story of how one man's professional competence helped give shape to one of history's darkest machines has left you wanting to explore these chapters more deeply, without the filters that sometimes soften the raw human reality, then you'll find real value in joining others who are drawn to the same unvarnished truths. My Patreon offers free podcasts, raw and unblurred video sections, and a space for those who want to go further into these stories together. It's a community of people who believe that understanding the past, even its most difficult parts, matters. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The engineer who had once drawn towers in a defeated port city had now helped draw the blueprint for an entirely different kind of structure. The order had been carried out with the same precision he brought to every task. The machine he helped birth would continue to function long after he moved on to other projects. And the human cost of that efficiency would continue to echo through the lives of everyone who had been caught inside it, whether they wore the uniform of the SS or the stripes of a prisoner. Kammler returned to his drafting table and his calculations, already looking toward the next set of requirements that would arrive. The shadows had lengthened around his work, but the lines on the paper remained as straight and purposeful as ever. In the quiet of an office far from the sounds of the camp, Hans Kammler spread the latest progress reports across his desk and began to see the outlines of a machine that was not yet running at its full, terrible capacity. He had been given the task of turning an idea into a functioning system, and now that the first building stood, he turned his attention to what he saw as the inefficiencies that still slowed the process. The flow of people arriving, the time it took to move them through each stage, the capacity of the structures meant to handle the final step, all of these could be improved. Kammler approached the problem the way he had always approached any engineering challenge. He looked for waste. He looked for delays. He looked for places where the human material moving through the system created friction that could be reduced. The language he used in his notes and in his meetings with camp officials remained the language of optimization. He spoke of increasing throughput, of reducing bottlenecks, of ensuring that the structures could handle greater volume without breaking down. He did not speak of the lives inside those numbers. That silence was not something he questioned. It was the same silence that had allowed him to rise so steadily inside the organization that now entrusted him with this work. When he visited the site again, the changes he proposed began to take physical shape. Larger chambers were designed so that more people could be brought inside at one time. Ventilation systems were adjusted to clear the space faster between groups. The crematoria were expanded and reconfigured so that the remains could be processed more quickly, reducing the accumulation that sometimes created its own delays. Kammler reviewed each modification with the same careful attention he had once given to bridge designs or housing projects. He asked for data on how long each stage currently took. He requested adjustments when the numbers did not meet the targets he had set. Subordinates who worked under him learned to bring him solutions rather than problems. He had little patience for those who hesitated or who seemed to linger over the human realities of what they were building. Efficiency was the only measure he accepted. There were men working inside the system who saw these changes differently. Among the prisoners forced to operate the crematoria and handle the bodies that came out of the chambers, there were quiet acts of resistance that never appeared in any official report. A man might linger a moment longer than necessary when moving a body, offering a small, hidden gesture of dignity to someone who had once been a stranger. Another might pass a piece of bread or a whispered word of comfort to someone still waiting in line. These moments were small and dangerous. They carried the risk of immediate punishment or death. Yet they happened because even in the midst of industrialized horror, some people refused to let the machine strip away every last trace of their humanity. Kammler never knew their names. He never heard their stories. His report spoke only of improved capacity and smoother operations. The quiet heroism that persisted inside the horror remained invisible to the man who measured success by how quickly the next group could be brought forward. For Kammler himself, the work carried a growing sense of professional satisfaction. Each adjustment he approved brought the system closer to what he considered proper function. He took pride in solving the practical problems that others had left unaddressed. When a superior asked for updates, Kammler could point to measurable improvements in the rate at which the camp could process arrivals. That ability to deliver results continued to mark him as valuable. It shielded him from the need to look too closely at what those results actually meant for the people whose lives were being measured in throughput. The part of him that had once drawn careful lines as a boy now drew lines that determined how many human beings could be moved through a building in a single hour. He did not see a contradiction. He saw only the next problem to be solved. The human cost of these improvements revealed itself in the daily lives of those trapped inside the system. A woman who had arrived with her family might find herself separated in moments, sent toward the chambers while her children were directed elsewhere. The redesigned flow meant that the time between arrival and the final step grew shorter. There was less opportunity for the small mercies that sometimes occurred in earlier, less efficient phases, a guard looking away for a moment, a prisoner finding a way to pass a message. The machine Kammler helped refine left fewer openings for chance or compassion. For the Sonderkommando prisoners forced to work inside the chambers and crematoria, the faster pace meant longer hours and deeper exhaustion. Some of them kept hidden notes or whispered plans for resistance, small acts of defiance that carried the hope of one day telling the world what they had been forced to witness. Those notes rarely survived. The resilience they represented did. Kammler returned to his own home in the evenings carrying the satisfaction of work that was progressing according to plan. His wife Yuta managed the household with the same steady presence she had always shown. The children asked ordinary questions about school and play, questions that belonged to a different world from the one their father was shaping. Kammler listened and answered with the same measured attention he gave to everything. He did not bring the details of his days across the threshold. The distance between the man who approved improvements to the killing machinery and the man who sat at the family table was maintained by silence. Yuta did not ask what occupied his thoughts during the long evenings when he reviewed reports. She had learned that some parts of his work existed in a space she was not invited to enter. The family continued its routines while, hundreds of kilometers away, the changes Kammler had ordered were making the process of death more efficient with every passing day. There were moments when the human reality pressed closer even to him. A report might mention a delay caused by prisoners who had resisted or by bodies that had not been processed quickly enough. Kammler would note the issue and issue instructions to prevent it from happening again. He did not dwell on the stories behind those delays. To dwell would have required acknowledging that the material moving through the system was not simply material. It was people who had once had names, families, and futures. That acknowledgement would have complicated the clean lines of his calculations. He kept the acknowledgement at bay by staying inside the language of engineering. The improvements he ordered were always framed as solutions to problems of capacity and flow. The fact that those problems involved human beings being murdered on an industrial scale remained outside the frame he allowed himself to see. Subordinates who worked more directly with the daily operations sometimes carried the weight more visibly. One foreman, a man who had risen through the same system that rewarded results, once questioned whether a particular adjustment Kammler had proposed would create unnecessary suffering before the final step. The question was phrased carefully, wrapped in the same professional language everyone used. Kammler listened and then explained that the goal was to reduce overall time and increase reliability. Suffering was not a variable he was asked to consider. The foreman nodded and returned to his duties. The exchange was brief, but it left a trace. Both men understood that continuing to question would lead only to their own removal from the work. The system protected itself by making efficiency the only acceptable standard. The educational weight of what Kammler was doing revealed itself not in any single dramatic moment, but in the steady accumulation of small professional choices. Each improvement he approved made the machinery of death more effective at what it was designed to do. Each report he signed contributed to a system that treated human lives as a resource to be processed rather than as lives to be protected. The banality of that process, the way ordinary bureaucratic language and engineering discipline could be turned to the task of genocide, was the true horror. Kammler was not a monster in the way stories sometimes portray such men. He was a professional who had found a place where his particular skills were valued and where the moral questions were answered by the hierarchy above him. That combination allowed him to redraw the plans for hell without ever having to call it by that name. The prisoners who endured the results of his improvements carried stories that would never appear in his reports. A young man forced into the Sonderkommando might spend his days handling the bodies of people who had arrived on the same train as him. He might find ways to sabotage small parts of the process, to slow things down just enough to give someone else a moment of awareness or dignity. Those acts of quiet resistance were acts of everyday heroism performed under conditions designed to strip away every trace of humanity. They happened because some people refused to let the machine win completely. Kammler never knew about them. His focus remained on the numbers that showed improved capacity. The human stories that existed in the gaps between those numbers remained invisible to the man who had been tasked with closing those gaps. As the improvements took hold, the camp became capable of handling greater numbers with greater speed. The changes Kammler had overseen were not the invention of the killing process itself. They were the refinement of it, the application of professional skill to make horror run more smoothly. That refinement carried consequences that reached far beyond the camp. It set a standard for how other sites would be organized. It demonstrated that even the most terrible tasks could be made more efficient when competent people applied themselves to the problem without asking why the problem existed in the first place. If these hidden refinements of a machinery built on human suffering have stirred your curiosity about the secret layers and forgotten personal stories that shaped the war in ways we rarely see, then you'll find real value in the free ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, which uncovers espionage, overlooked facts, and the hidden heroes whose quiet actions made a difference even in the darkest chapters. You can receive it along with weekly deep dives by signing up through the secure link in the description below. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Kammler moved on from the immediate work of redesigning the chambers and crematoria with the same steady sense of having delivered what was required. The machine he had helped refine continued to function, now capable of processing more lives in less time. The human cost of that efficiency accumulated in places he did not visit and in stories he did not hear. The engineer who had once sought order in a defeated nation had found a place where his talent for improvement served an order whose true nature he chose not to examine too closely. The lines he drew continued to shape outcomes long after he turned his attention to the next set of requirements the SS placed before him. The hell he had helped redraw was not the product of a single dramatic decision. It was the product of many small, professional choices made by a man who measured his success by how well the system performed the task it had been given. In the expanding network of camps that stretched across occupied lands, Hans Kammler found his authority growing with each new set of plans he reviewed, until the reach of his decisions touched places he would never visit and lives he would never know by name. The order came through the usual channels, another set of requirements from above that carried the weight of Heinrich Himmler's approval. Kammler was to take greater responsibility for construction across the entire system of camps. What had begun as oversight of one major site now extended to others scattered through the territories under German control. Majdanek, Belzec, and smaller outposts all fell under his expanding domain. The task was not to invent new purposes but to ensure that existing ones operated with the same relentless efficiency he had already demonstrated. He approached the assignment with the same focused attention he brought to every project. Maps and reports arrived on his desk. He studied the layouts, identified where capacity could be increased and where bottlenecks still slowed the movement of people and materials. His notes were precise and practical. He asked for updates on labor availability, on supply lines, on the condition of existing structures. The answers came back in the same professional language he used himself. No one needed to explain the ultimate purpose of the places he was helping to strengthen. That understanding was already assumed. Kammler's growing dominion brought him into closer contact with other SS leaders who ran the day-to-day operations of individual camps. Some welcomed the additional resources and clearer direction his involvement promised. Others resented the intrusion of an outsider who measured their work by numbers rather than by the local realities they faced. He navigated these tensions with the same calm competence that had carried him upward. When a camp commandant complained that the pace demanded from above was unrealistic given the condition of the prisoners, Kammler listened and then pointed to adjustments that had already improved output elsewhere. The message was clear: the system could be made to function better if the right methods were applied. Resistance to those methods was treated as a problem to be solved rather than a concern to be debated. Over time, the resistance faded. Camp officials learned that cooperation with Kammler's office brought support and advancement, while hesitation brought scrutiny and replacement. The human stories unfolding inside those camps carried the weight of his decisions even when he never set foot on their grounds. At Majdanek, prisoners endured conditions that grew harsher as construction accelerated. A man who had once been a teacher might find himself forced to carry stones for new barracks while guards shouted orders that offered no room for rest. Small acts of kindness still flickered in the exhaustion. One prisoner might share a hidden crust of bread with another who was weakening. A whispered word of encouragement might pass between people who had never met before their arrival. These moments were fragile and dangerous. They required courage that the system was designed to crush. Yet they persisted because some people refused to let the machinery of suffering strip away every last trace of their shared humanity. Kammler's reports never mentioned these moments. They spoke instead of improved capacity and more reliable labor output. The quiet resilience that survived inside the horror remained invisible to the man whose authority now stretched across multiple sites. At Belzec, the situation was even more stark. The camp had been built for a single, terrible purpose, and Kammler's involvement focused on ensuring that purpose could be carried out without interruption. Prisoners there lived under constant threat, knowing that survival depended on staying useful for as long as the system allowed. Some found ways to preserve fragments of dignity. A woman might comfort a child who had been separated from her mother. A man might pass along a hidden message or a small object that carried meaning beyond its material worth. These acts of everyday heroism happened in the narrow spaces between selections and forced labor. They were performed by people who had every reason to despair yet chose, in small ways, to resist the complete erasure of their humanity. Kammler never heard their stories. His focus remained on the structures and the flow of people through them. The emotional consequences of his decisions accumulated in places far from his desk, carried in the hearts of survivors and in the memories of those who did not survive. For Kammler himself, the expansion of his power brought a deepening sense of professional satisfaction. He was no longer simply executing orders for a single project. He was shaping the standards that other camps would follow. When he issued directives about construction methods or labor management, those directives carried the force of higher authority. Subordinates learned to anticipate what he would approve and what he would reject. The culture inside his office rewarded precision and speed. It had little tolerance for hesitation or for questions that lingered on the human cost of the work. Kammler moved through this environment with growing confidence. He had found a place where his particular skills were not only valued but actively required. The pride he felt in delivering results was real. It coexisted with the knowledge of what those results enabled, yet he kept that knowledge contained within the boundaries of professional duty. To step outside those boundaries would have meant questioning the entire structure that had lifted him so far. There were moments when the human reality of his growing dominion pressed closer than usual. A report from one of the camps might describe a delay caused by prisoners who had collapsed under the workload or by guards who had shown unexpected leniency. Kammler would note the issue and issue instructions to prevent recurrence. He did not dwell on the individual lives behind those delays. To do so would have required acknowledging that the labor force he treated as a resource was made up of people who had once had families, professions, and futures. That acknowledgement remained outside the frame he allowed himself. Instead, he focused on the next adjustment, the next improvement that would bring the system closer to the efficiency he demanded. The emotional distance he maintained was not unique to him. It was the distance that the entire bureaucratic machinery encouraged and rewarded. Men who could not maintain that distance were replaced by men who could. At home, the contrast between Kammler's professional life and his private one remained carefully preserved. Jutta managed the household with the same quiet strength she had always shown. Their children grew older in a world that still held ordinary routines of school and play. Kammler returned to that world each evening carrying the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives he would never meet. He did not speak of those decisions. The silence had become a habit that protected both him and his family from the full reality of his work. There were evenings when he sat with reports spread before him, his mind tracing the connections between distant camps and the central office that now coordinated them. Jutta would watch him without asking questions she knew he would not answer. The distance between them was not spoken, yet it shaped the atmosphere of their home in ways that grew harder to ignore as his authority expanded. The educational weight of Kammler's rising power revealed itself in the way one man's competence could multiply suffering across an entire system. He did not invent the camps or their purpose. He refined and extended them. He applied the same engineering mindset that had once sought to build useful structures in a defeated nation to the task of making instruments of destruction more reliable and more efficient. The human stories that resulted were stories of endurance under conditions designed to destroy endurance. Prisoners across multiple camps found ways to preserve fragments of hope and connection. A hidden letter passed between hands might carry news of a family member still alive. A small act of sabotage might slow a process just enough to give someone else a moment of awareness. These acts of quiet resistance happened because some people refused to accept the complete victory of the machine. They happened in defiance of the very efficiency Kammler worked to increase. As his dominion grew, Kammler became a central figure in the SS construction apparatus. Other projects began to come under his influence. The standards he set for labor management and structural design spread through the system. Camp officials who wanted to advance learned to align themselves with his methods. Those who resisted found themselves sidelined. The power he accumulated was not the dramatic power of a battlefield commander. It was the quieter power of a bureaucrat whose decisions shaped the daily reality of thousands. That power allowed him to move resources, to prioritize certain sites over others, to reward subordinates who delivered results. It also carried the responsibility for the human consequences that followed every improvement he approved. Kammler carried that responsibility by continuing to treat it as a technical matter rather than a moral one. The distinction protected him from the full weight of what he was helping to create. The stories of those who suffered under his expanding authority continued to unfold in places he would never see. A prisoner at one camp might survive long enough to witness the arrival of new transports and the selections that followed. Another might find a way to pass along a fragment of information that helped someone else endure one more day. These small acts of resilience and heroism happened in the narrow spaces the system left open. They were performed by people whose names Kammler would never know and whose courage he would never recognize. Yet they represented the human spirit refusing to be completely extinguished even under the machinery he helped strengthen. The educational lesson embedded in those stories was not one of dramatic resistance or heroic rescue. It was the quieter lesson of how ordinary people, placed in extraordinary circumstances, still found ways to affirm their shared humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it. If the vast human stories of endurance and quiet defiance across this growing empire of suffering have left you wanting to hold onto a tangible connection with the personal histories of that era, you might find real value in exploring World War II memorabilia that lets you touch pieces of the past, or in settling in with a powerful film like Midway on Prime that brings the human courage and sacrifice of those years to the screen in such a visceral way. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Kammler continued to review reports and issue directives as his authority reached further into the camp system. The empire he helped shape grew more coordinated and more efficient with each passing month. The human cost of that coordination accumulated in the daily suffering of prisoners and in the small, defiant acts that still flickered inside the darkness. He returned to his desk each day with the same steady focus, already looking toward the next set of requirements that would arrive from above. The dominion he had acquired was built on the same foundation that had carried him from the beginning, the ability to deliver measurable results without pausing to examine the human reality those results created. That ability would carry him into even greater responsibilities in the years ahead, responsibilities that would test the boundaries of what one man's professional competence could be asked to serve. In the closing years of a war that Germany was clearly losing, an ambitious engineer watched the rocket program falter under army control and recognized the moment when the SS could claim the future for itself. Hans Kammler had already proven his value by turning the construction of camps into an efficient system. Now he saw another opportunity in the secret weapons that were supposed to reverse the tide. The V-2 rockets, those long-range missiles that had once promised to strike terror into distant cities, were falling behind schedule. Production was scattered, vulnerable to Allied bombing, and slowed by the very bureaucracy that had once protected it. Kammler began to position himself as the man who could fix all of that. He spoke of underground factories that could be carved into mountains, protected from the skies, and run with the same relentless discipline he had already brought to the camp system. The idea was not entirely new, but Kammler had the advantage of already controlling vast pools of forced labor and the construction expertise to make it real. He presented his case with the calm confidence of someone who had learned that results mattered more than rank or tradition. The Army officers who had guided the rocket work from the beginning sensed the threat. They had built the program through years of careful engineering and political maneuvering. Now an SS general with no background in rocketry was arguing that only the SS could deliver the scale and speed required. Kammler did not argue on technical grounds. He argued on results. He pointed to the camps he had already expanded and the construction projects completed under impossible deadlines. He offered the one resource the Army could no longer guarantee: protected labor deep underground, far from the bombing raids that were destroying factories on the surface. The scientists who had devoted their careers to the rockets listened to these proposals with a mixture of hope and unease. Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger had worked for years to keep their project under military rather than SS control. They understood the difference in methods. The Army had demanded results but still operated within certain boundaries. The SS, they feared, would treat human beings as expendable in ways even the Army had resisted. Kammler moved quickly once the decision shifted in his favor. He took control of the underground facilities already under construction in the Harz Mountains. What had been a scattered effort became a single, centralized project under his authority. He brought in the same organizational approach he had used for the camps. Teams of prisoners, many of them already weakened from earlier camps, were marched into the tunnels to carve out vast spaces where the rockets could be assembled in safety. The work was brutal from the first day. The tunnels were cold and damp, the air thick with dust and the fumes of explosives used to blast through rock. Prisoners worked without adequate food or rest, driven by guards who had learned that failure meant punishment for everyone. Kammler reviewed progress reports with the same steady attention he had once given to camp blueprints. He noted where the digging advanced too slowly and issued orders to increase the pressure. He did not visit the tunnels himself in those early weeks. His role was to set the targets and ensure that the resources flowed to meet them. The human cost revealed itself immediately in the stories that filtered back through the system. A prisoner who had once been an engineer in another country might find himself swinging a pickaxe in near darkness, his hands bleeding from the rough tools and the cold. Another might collapse from exhaustion only to be dragged aside so the work could continue without interruption. Small acts of kindness still appeared in the narrow spaces between shifts. One man might share a crust of bread saved from his own meager ration with a weaker companion. Another might whisper a few words of encouragement or help steady someone who was about to fall. These moments required courage because discovery could mean immediate death. They happened because even under the most crushing conditions, some people refused to let the system turn them completely against one another. Kammler's reports never recorded these moments. They spoke only of meters of tunnel completed and the number of rockets moving toward assembly. The quiet resilience that persisted inside the horror remained invisible to the man whose orders had placed those prisoners there. The scientists who now answered to Kammler felt the change in atmosphere almost at once. Von Braun had spent years protecting his team and his vision from political interference. He had cultivated relationships with Army leaders who understood the technical challenges. Suddenly he found himself dealing with an SS general who measured progress in output rather than in breakthroughs. Dornberger, the military head of the program, tried to maintain a buffer between the scientists and the harsher methods Kammler introduced. He arranged meetings and sent careful reports that emphasized the need for skilled labor alongside the forced workers. Kammler listened politely and then issued new quotas. The scientists began to understand that their previous protections were eroding. Some of them justified the shift by telling themselves that the rockets were essential to Germany's survival. Others carried private doubts that they rarely voiced even among themselves. A letter from one engineer to his wife, written in careful language to avoid censorship, spoke of long hours and difficult conditions without ever naming the source of the difficulty. The letter ended with the hope that the work would soon bring the war to an end. The writer did not say whose war he hoped would end. Kammler himself felt the satisfaction of another victory. He had taken control of one of the most prestigious projects in the Reich. The rockets that could reach. across borders now depended on his ability to deliver production. He moved his own staff into key positions and began to reorganize the supply lines that fed the underground factories. The satisfaction was not loud or boastful. It showed in the way he carried himself in meetings and the calm certainty with which he answered questions about timelines. He had learned that power in the SS came to those who could be trusted to deliver without drama. The human price of that delivery was something he had already learned to set aside. When reports reached him about high death rates among the tunnel workers, he noted the need for more replacements and continued with the next item on his list. The prisoners who died were replaced by new arrivals from other camps. The work did not pause. There were moments when the human reality of the underground factories pressed closer even to those who tried to keep their distance. A scientist visiting the tunnels for the first time might see the faces of the prisoners and recognize that many of them had once held positions similar to his own. The sight could linger in the mind long after the visit ended. Some of the scientists began to speak more quietly among themselves about the methods being used. They did not question the necessity of the rockets. They questioned whether the speed Kammler demanded could be sustained without destroying the very workforce required to build them. These conversations stayed private. No one wanted to be the first to raise concerns that might be interpreted as disloyalty. Kammler's authority was still new, but it was already clear that he had the backing of the highest levels. Challenging him carried risks that few were willing to accept. The prisoners who survived the early months of the underground work developed their own forms of quiet resistance. Some slowed their pace just enough to conserve strength without drawing attention. Others passed along scraps of information about conditions to new arrivals, helping them understand what to expect and how to endure. A few managed to hide small tools or pieces of paper on which they wrote fragments of their experiences. These acts of everyday heroism were performed under the constant threat of discovery. They mattered because they reminded the prisoners that they were still human even when the system treated them as disposable. Kammler never knew about these acts. His focus remained on the rockets that would eventually emerge from the tunnels and on the production numbers that would prove his success to those above him. As the underground factories took shape, Kammler's influence within the SS continued to grow. He was no longer simply a construction specialist. He had become the man who could deliver the weapons that the leadership believed might still change the course of the war. That position brought new pressures. He had to balance the demands of the scientists, who needed time and skilled hands, with the demands of his superiors, who wanted results as quickly as possible. He navigated these tensions by promising both speed and quality, knowing that the human cost would be paid by people who had no voice in the meetings where those promises were made. The educational weight of his rise revealed itself in the way technical ambition and ideological power had merged. The rockets represented the pinnacle of German engineering. The labor that built them represented the lowest point of human exploitation. Kammler stood at the intersection of both, treating them as parts of the same problem to be solved. The scientists who worked under his new authority began to adjust their own expectations. Von Braun continued to push for technical excellence, but he did so within the framework Kammler had established. Dornberger tried to protect the core team while accepting that the broader workforce would be managed differently. Both men carried the knowledge that their work now depended on methods they had once hoped to avoid. They justified their continued involvement by focusing on the rockets themselves, on the engineering challenges that still needed to be solved. The moral questions that surrounded the labor remained in the background, acknowledged in private conversations but rarely brought into the official record. Kammler, for his part, seemed untroubled by the arrangement. He had seized the program he wanted and was now shaping it according to the standards he had already proven effective in other areas. If the hidden suffering inside those mountain tunnels and the quiet defiance that still flickered there have left you wanting to see what the official records never showed, there are collections of raw, uncensored images and footage from that time that reveal the harsh realities behind the uniforms and the production numbers. You can find them through a secure digital product made available for those who want the unfiltered visual record. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Kammler returned to his office after each inspection or meeting with the same steady focus. The rockets were moving forward. The underground factories were growing. His authority within the SS was expanding with every success. He did not dwell on the faces he had seen in the tunnels or the reports of replacements needed because so many workers had not survived. Those details were part of the cost of delivering what had been asked. The part of him that had once drawn careful lines as a boy now drew lines that determined how many human beings would be spent to produce each rocket. He told himself that the larger struggle justified the methods. The scientists who worked alongside him told themselves similar things. The prisoners who endured the tunnels told themselves only that they must survive one more day. The stories of all three groups were now bound together by the project Kammler had seized. The future of the rockets and the future of the people building them had become inseparable, even if only one of those futures was ever discussed in the meetings where decisions were made. Deep inside a mountain in the heart of Germany, thousands of men were being consumed by the very tunnels they were forced to carve, their bodies breaking while the rockets they assembled rose toward a future that would never belong to them. Hans Kammler had seized control of the V2 program with the same calculated precision he brought to every challenge. Now the underground factories in the Harz Mountains became the proving ground for his methods. What had once been scattered production sites were consolidated into a single, hidden complex where the rockets could be built beyond the reach of Allied bombers. Kammler reviewed the reports from his desk with the steady attention of a man who measured success in output and timelines. The numbers told him how many meters of tunnel had been completed, how many rocket components had moved from assembly to testing. They did not tell him the names of the men who had collapsed while swinging pickaxes or the faces of those who had been dragged away when they could no longer stand. Those details remained outside the frame he allowed himself to see. His role was to deliver results, and he approached that role with the same focused determination that had already carried him so far. The prisoners who arrived at the Dora camp to feed the tunnels came from across Europe. Many had already survived other camps. They carried with them the quiet knowledge that survival depended on staying useful for as long as the system permitted. A former teacher from Poland might find himself assigned to the same work gang as a French resistance fighter and a Russian soldier. They spoke different languages and came from different worlds, yet they learned quickly to communicate through gestures and shared glances. In the dim light of the tunnels, small acts of kindness became lifelines. One man might pass a crust of bread to another who was weakening, knowing that the gesture could cost him his own ration if discovered. Another might steady a companion who stumbled under the weight of a rock, offering a brief moment of human connection in a place designed to erase every trace of it. These moments were fragile and dangerous. They required courage that the guards were trained to crush. Yet they happened because some people refused to let the machinery of suffering turn them completely against one another. Kammler's pressure for speed created conditions that made even those small mercies rarer. The quotas he set demanded that the tunnels expand faster than the prisoners could safely work. Shifts stretched long into the night. Food was scarce and often spoiled. Disease spread quickly in the damp, overcrowded spaces. Men who fell ill were removed without ceremony, replaced by new arrivals who had not yet learned the brutal rhythms of the work. A prisoner who had once been a doctor might try to offer what little help he could to those around him, using scraps of knowledge and whatever materials he could hide. His efforts were acts of quiet heroism performed under constant threat. They did not change the larger system, but they preserved something essential in the men who received them. Kammler never knew these individual stories. His report spoke of labor shortages and the need for more replacements. The human reality behind those shortages remained invisible to the man whose orders had created them. There were moments when the human cost pressed closer even to those who tried to keep their distance. Engineers and technicians who visited the tunnels to oversee rocket assemblies sometimes saw the faces of the prisoners and recognized that many of them had once held positions similar to their own. A scientist who had spent years designing components might find himself walking past men who could have been his colleagues in another life. The sight could linger. Some of them carried private doubts back to their quarters, questions they rarely voiced even among themselves. They told themselves that the rockets were necessary, that the labor was a wartime necessity, that questioning the methods would only slow the work that might still turn the tide. These justifications allowed them to continue. Yet the justifications grew thinner with each visit to the tunnels. The contrast between the clean drawings on the drafting tables and the broken bodies in the rock was impossible to ignore entirely. Kammler himself maintained the distance that his position required. When reports reached him about high mortality rates or prisoners who had sabotaged small parts of the process, he treated them as production problems to be solved. Sabotage was met with harsher security. Mortality was met with demands for more laborers. He did not linger over the personal stories of those who died or those who resisted. To do so would have required acknowledging that the human material moving through the tunnels was not simply material. It was people who had once had families, professions, and futures. That acknowledgement remained outside the boundaries he had learned to maintain. Instead, he focused on the next quota, the next adjustment that would bring the underground city closer to the efficiency he demanded. The satisfaction he felt in delivering results was real. It coexisted with the knowledge of what those results cost, yet he kept that knowledge contained within the language of engineering and necessity. The prisoners who survived the longest developed their own forms of quiet resistance. Some slowed their pace just enough to conserve strength without drawing attention from the guards. Others passed along scraps of information to new arrivals, helping them understand what to expect and how to endure. A few managed to hide small pieces of paper on which they wrote fragments of their experiences or messages to the world outside. These acts of everyday heroism were performed in the narrow spaces the system left open. They mattered because they reminded the prisoners that they were still human even when the system treated them as disposable. One man might risk everything to hide a note describing the conditions, hoping that someday it would reach someone who could bear witness. Another might share a hidden tool or word of encouragement that kept a companion from giving up. These moments did not stop the rockets from being built. They did not change Kammler's orders or the quotas he enforced. But they preserved something essential in the men who performed them, a refusal to let the mountain of the dead claim every last trace of their dignity. The emotional consequences of the work reached beyond the tunnels themselves. Families left behind in distant countries waited for news that never came. A wife in France might receive a single letter describing conditions in careful language before the letters stopped entirely. A mother in Poland might never learn what happened to her son after he was taken. The absence created its own kind of suffering, a long, slow grief that had no resolution. For the prisoners who survived long enough to be liberated, the memories of the tunnels would shape the rest of their lives. Some would speak of the small kindnesses that had kept them alive. Others would carry the silence of what they had witnessed and what they had been forced to do. The system Kammler had helped organize left scars that no report could measure. Kammler continued to review the production numbers as the underground factories grew. The rockets began to emerge from the mountain in greater numbers. Each successful launch was noted as progress. Each delay was treated as a problem to be corrected. He moved through his days with the same steady focus that had defined his rise. The mountain of the dead remained hidden from his direct view, yet every order he issued contributed to the conditions inside it. The human stories that unfolded there were stories of endurance under circumstances designed to destroy endurance. There were stories of people who found ways to affirm their shared humanity even when everything around them was engineered to deny it. Kammler did not hear those stories. He heard only the reports that confirmed the work was moving forward according to plan. If these buried stories of suffering and quiet defiance inside the mountain have reminded you how much careful, dedicated work it takes to bring such hidden chapters into the light, Then you understand why these narratives depend on people who believe in keeping history alive. If you found value in the way we uncover these human truths together, a small tip, even as little as $1, through Ko-Fi helps support the research and time that go into crafting them. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The mountain continued to consume men while the rockets it produced carried the hope of those who had ordered them built. Kammler's authority grew with every success. He had delivered what was asked, and the system rewarded him with greater responsibility. The prisoners who endured the tunnels carried their own rewards in the small acts of resistance and kindness that had kept something human alive inside the darkness. Those acts would never appear in any official report. They would never change the course of the war or the quotas Kammler enforced. But they stood as quiet proof that even in the deepest tunnels, carved by forced hands under impossible pressure, the human spirit could still find ways to reach toward light. The mountain of the dead held both the machinery of destruction and the stubborn persistence of those who refused to be completely destroyed. Kammler's orders shaped the first. The prisoners' quiet choices shaped the second. Both would echo long after the tunnels were emptied and the rockets had fallen silent. In the hidden world of secret weapons where dreams of reaching the stars met the brutal machinery of war, brilliant engineers who had spent their lives chasing the future found themselves forced into partnership with a man who treated human lives as just another resource to be spent. Hans Kammler had claimed the V2 program with the same steady calculation that had already carried him through the camps. Now the scientists who had built the rockets under army protection discovered that their work belonged to the SS. Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger had spent years protecting their team and their vision. They had navigated political pressures and technical setbacks while keeping the project alive. Suddenly they answered to a general who had no patience for hesitation and no interest in the human cost of speed. Kammler arrived with quotas that dwarfed anything the army had demanded. He spoke of underground factories already under construction and of labor that could be replaced when it failed. The scientists listened and understood that the rules had changed. Von Braun carried the weight of that change in private moments he rarely shared. He had always believed the rockets represented something larger than any single war. In quiet conversations with close colleagues he spoke of reaching beyond the atmosphere, of opening new frontiers. Yet the reality of the tunnels pressed against those dreams. When he visited the underground sites he saw men who had once been engineers and teachers now reduced to swinging pickaxes in near darkness. Some of them recognized him. A few had worked in related fields before the war. Their eyes held questions he could not answer. Von Braun returned to his drawings and calculations with a heavier step. He told himself that the work must continue, that stopping would only hand victory to those who would use the rockets for worse ends. The justification helped him keep moving. It did not remove the image of those faces from his mind. Dornberger tried to create a buffer between the scientists and the harsher methods Kammler introduced. He arranged meetings and sent careful reports that emphasized the need for skilled hands alongside the forced labor. He knew the difference between the Army's approach and the SS approach. The Army had demanded results but still operated within certain boundaries of discipline and order. Kammler's methods treated prisoners as expendable in ways that even hardened officers found difficult to accept. Dornberger used his military rank and long relationship with the program to push back where he could. He requested better food and medical care for the workers who held critical technical knowledge. Kammler listened and sometimes agreed when it served production. More often he reminded Dornberger that replacements were always available. The message was clear. The old protections were eroding. Kammler himself viewed the scientists as valuable tools that required careful handling. He respected their technical skill even as he dismissed their concerns about pace and conditions. In his mind, the rockets were a weapon that could still alter the course of a losing war. Every delay was a threat to that possibility. He measured progress in the number of rockets moving from the tunnels to the launch sites. Human suffering was a variable he had already learned to set aside in other projects. When von Braun or Dornberger raised questions about the treatment of the workforce, Kammler answered with the same calm logic he used for every problem. The system required speed. Speed required pressure. Pressure produced results. The conversation usually ended there. There were moments when the human reality of the alliance surfaced in small, revealing ways. A young engineer on von Braun's team once accompanied a group of scientists into the tunnels to inspect assembly work. He saw a prisoner who had clearly once been educated struggling to lift a heavy component. Without thinking, the engineer stepped forward to help. A guard immediately intervened, reminding him that such gestures only encouraged weakness. The young man returned to the surface shaken. Later that evening he wrote a careful letter to his wife describing the visit without naming the place or the details. He spoke of long hours and difficult conditions. He ended by saying the work was important and that he hoped it would soon bring peace. The letter was never sent. It remained in his pocket until the war ended, a private record of a moment when professional duty collided with simple human instinct. Von Braun carried similar private burdens. He had built a life around the belief that technical excellence could transcend politics. The alliance with Kammler tested that belief daily. In meetings he presented data on production bottlenecks and requested adjustments that might ease the strain on skilled workers. Kammler approved some changes when they improved output. He rejected others when they slowed the schedule. Von Braun learned to frame his requests in terms of efficiency rather than humanity. The language protected him from direct confrontation while still allowing small improvements. It also deepened the distance between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. Colleagues noticed a change. Some of them began to keep their own doubts private, understanding that open disagreement could end their involvement in the program they had spent years building. The prisoners who made the rockets possible lived in a different reality entirely. In the tunnels, a former mathematician might find himself working beside a farmer and a shopkeeper. They shared the same exhaustion and the same fear. Small acts of kindness still appeared in the narrow spaces between shifts. One man might save a piece of bread for another who was weakening. Another might pass along a whispered warning about an upcoming selection or inspection. These moments required courage because discovery meant punishment or death. They happened because some people refused to let the system strip away every trace of their shared humanity. The rockets they assembled carried none of that humanity in their design. They were machines built by broken hands under the direction of men who measured success in numbers. Kammler's growing power within the SS made the alliance increasingly one-sided. He controlled the labor, the facilities, and the security. The scientists controlled the technical knowledge. Both sides needed the other, yet the balance of need shifted steadily toward Kammler. When production fell behind, he did not hesitate to bring in more prisoners or to replace entire work gangs. The scientists watched these decisions and understood that their influence was limited. Some of them began to focus only on the engineering challenges that still excited them. Others carried a growing sense of unease that followed them home at night. Dornberger continued his efforts to protect the core team, using his military position to shield von Braun and the most valuable engineers from direct SS oversight. The protection was partial and temporary. Everyone understood that Kammler's authority was expanding. There were evenings when von Braun sat alone with his notes and allowed himself to consider what the work had cost. He thought of the men in the tunnels whose lives were measured in days rather than years. He thought of the rockets that would soon carry destruction to distant cities. He thought of the future he had once imagined, a future of exploration rather than warfare. The thoughts did not change his actions. He returned to his calculations the next morning with the same disciplined focus that had defined his career. The alliance with Kammler was not something he had chosen, but it was something he had accepted. That acceptance carried its own quiet price. It separated him from the man he had been before the war and from the man he might have become in a different world. Kammler, for his part, felt little of that separation. He had already learned to treat the human cost of his work as a necessary part of larger goals. The scientists were simply another resource to be managed. The discomfort did not concern him as long as they continued to deliver results. When von Braun requested better conditions for certain skilled prisoners, Kammler sometimes granted the request and sometimes did not. The decisions were always framed in terms of production rather than mercy. Kammler had no interest in mercy. He had interest in outcomes. The uneasy alliance continued because both sides still needed what the other provided. The rockets moved forward. The tunnels grew deeper. The human stories inside them remained largely invisible to the men who directed the work from above. If the hidden tensions between vision and brutality in this secret alliance have left you wanting to explore these moral complexities and personal compromises more deeply with others who share the same curiosity, then you'll find real value in joining a community of history lovers who gather for uncensored conversations and raw explorations of the past. My Patreon offers free podcasts, unblurred video sections, and a space where we can go further into these stories together without the filters that sometimes soften the truth. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The partnership between the scientists and the man who controlled their labor would shape the final months of the rocket program. Von Braun and Dornberger continued to push for technical excellence within the constraints Kammler imposed. Kammler continued to demand speed and results without regard for the human price. The rockets that eventually launched carried both the brilliance of one side and the brutality of the other. The men who had once dreamed of reaching the stars now worked under the shadow of a system that measured progress in lives consumed. That shadow would follow them long after the war ended. It would follow the prisoners who survived and the families who waited for news that never came. It would follow the uneasy alliance itself into the post-war world where some of the same scientists would be asked to explain what they had accepted in the name of progress. The questions would linger because the answers could never fully separate the dream from the cost of building it. In the final year of a collapsing empire, one man found himself holding near total authority over the Reich's most desperate secrets, his power growing even as the world he served crumbled around him. Hans Kammler had already proven he could deliver results where others faltered. Now, as Allied armies pressed from every direction and German cities burned under nightly bombing, the leadership turned to him with sweeping new responsibilities. He was given control over the emergency fighter program, the urgent effort to produce jet aircraft that might still turn the tide in the skies. He was placed in charge of additional underground factories and research sites scattered across what remained of German-held territory. The orders came with broad authority and few questions asked. Kammler accepted them with the same measured calm he had shown since his earliest days in the SS. He understood that in a regime facing defeat, the men who could still produce weapons and move resources held influence that went far beyond their formal rank. His domain expanded rapidly. He issued directives that reached across multiple projects. He decided which facilities received priority for labor, materials, and protection. Subordinates learned to bring him problems only when they had already prepared solutions. Hesitation or excuses were no longer tolerated. The scientists who had once operated under army oversight now found themselves completely within Kammler's orbit. Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger continued their work on the rockets, but every request for resources or personnel now passed through Kammler's office. He listened to their technical concerns with polite attention and then made decisions based on what would keep production moving. When von Braun argued for protecting certain skilled workers from the harshest conditions, Kammler sometimes granted limited concessions. More often he reminded the scientists that replacements could always be found. The partnership that had begun as an uneasy alliance had become something closer to dependence. The scientists needed Kammler's protection and resources to continue their work. Kammler needed their expertise to deliver the weapons that might still justify his growing power. Neither side could afford to break the arrangement, yet both carried private frustrations that surfaced in small, telling ways. Von Braun felt the shift most acutely. He had spent years building a team and a vision around technical excellence. Now he watched as the conditions in the underground factories grew worse under the pressure Kammler applied. Prisoners who had once been treated as valuable labor were pushed harder and replaced more quickly when they failed. Von Braun continued to request better treatment for those with specialized skills, framing his arguments in terms of efficiency rather than mercy. Kammler approved some of these requests when they served production goals. He rejected others without explanation. In private moments, von Braun confided in close colleagues that the work had become something he no longer fully recognized. The rockets still represented a technical achievement, but the human cost of building them had grown so visible that it could no longer be ignored. He did not stop. He could not stop. The momentum of the program and the authority of the man who now controlled it carried him forward even as his own doubts deepened. Kammler himself moved through this period of expanding power with a growing sense of isolation. He had risen by delivering results without drama. Now the results he delivered existed in a world that was visibly ending. Reports arrived daily about lost territory, destroyed factories, and collapsing supply lines. He read them with the same steady attention he gave to production quotas. He issued orders to move key personnel and equipment to safer locations, often in the southern regions where the leadership hoped to establish a final redoubt. These evacuations were carried out under his direction. Scientists, engineers, and selected prisoners were loaded onto trains and trucks and sent south while others were left behind. Kammler decided who was essential and who was not. The decisions carried life and death consequences that he treated as administrative necessities. A skilled technician might be moved to safety while an entire work gang of prisoners remained in a doomed facility. Kammler did not linger over the human details. He focused on preserving the capacity to continue the work. There were moments when the human reality of his near-total control pressed closer than usual. A subordinate once brought him a report about prisoners who had attempted a small act of sabotage in one of the underground sites. The damage was minor, but the incident revealed that even under constant surveillance, resistance could still occur. Kammler ordered harsher security measures and faster replacement of suspected troublemakers. The subordinate left the meeting with a clearer understanding that mercy was no longer part of the vocabulary in Kammler's domain. Later that evening, the same subordinate wrote a brief letter to his wife describing the pressure of the work without naming the specific projects. He spoke of long hours and difficult decisions. He ended by saying he hoped the war would soon be over so they could return to a normal life. The letter was never posted. It remained among his private papers, a quiet record of a man who had learned to carry out orders he no longer fully believed in. Kammler's authority extended beyond the rockets and fighters into the broader network of secret projects. He coordinated the movement of research materials and personnel to locations that were meant to remain hidden until the final stand. In these efforts he worked with a small circle of trusted aides who understood that loyalty to him was the surest path to survival in the collapsing system. These aides carried out his orders with efficiency and without question. They knew that hesitation could mean removal or worse. Kammler rewarded results and punished delay. The culture he created around himself was one of absolute obedience and measurable output. In that environment, small acts of quiet resistance became even rarer. A clerk might occasionally misfile a report to buy a few extra hours for someone marked for transfer. A guard might look the other way when a prisoner shared a piece of bread. These moments were performed at great personal risk and offered little real relief in the larger machinery of control. Yet they happened because some people still refused to let the system claim every last trace of their humanity. The scientists who remained under Kammler's oversight continued to navigate the narrowing space between their technical work and the moral weight of the conditions around them. Von Braun focused on solving the engineering problems that still challenged the rocket program. He spent long hours with calculations and test results, trying to improve reliability even as production quotas grew more unrealistic. Dornberger used his military background to maintain a fragile buffer between the SS methods and the core scientific team. He arranged for certain specialists to be moved south with their families when possible, using whatever influence he still held. These small protections were acts of quiet resistance within a system that allowed little room for them. They did not change the overall direction of the work. They did not slow the suffering in the tunnels or the factories. But they preserved something essential in the men who performed them, a refusal to accept complete surrender to the logic of total war. Kammler's near-total control in his domain stood in stark contrast to the collapse happening everywhere else. He could still move resources and issue orders that were obeyed. He could still demand and receive results from the projects under his authority. Yet each success existed inside a larger failure that no amount of efficiency could reverse. The rockets that launched from hidden sites reached their targets, but they could not stop the advance of Allied armies. The jet fighters that emerged from underground assembly lines flew against overwhelming odds. Kammler read the reports of these launches and flights with the same professional attention he had always shown. He noted improvements in performance and areas that still needed work. He did not dwell on the fact that the war was already lost. That acknowledgement would have required admitting that the power he had accumulated was ultimately meaningless in the face of the larger defeat. He kept that acknowledgement at bay by focusing on the next quota, the next evacuation, the next improvement. There were evenings when Kammler sat alone with the latest dispatches and allowed himself to consider the narrowing future. He thought of the personnel he had moved south and the facilities he had ordered destroyed to prevent capture. He thought of the scientists who still worked under his direction and the prisoners whose labor made that work possible. He did not linger on these thoughts for long. The habit of focusing on immediate tasks had become too strong to break. He returned to his papers and issued the next set of orders with the same steady hand that had guided him through every previous challenge. The power he held was real within its boundaries. Outside those boundaries, the world he had helped build was already coming apart. If these hidden stories of desperate power and quiet human resistance in the Reich's final months have stirred your curiosity about the secret layers and forgotten personal struggles that shaped the war's end, then you'll find real value in the free ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, which uncovers espionage, overlooked facts, and the hidden heroes whose quiet actions made a difference even in the darkest chapters. You can receive it along with weekly deep dives by signing up through the secure link in the description below. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Kammler continued to exercise his near-total control over the projects that remained under his authority. The scientists adapted to the narrowing options. The prisoners endured the conditions they could not escape. The small acts of resistance and kindness that still occurred did so in the narrow spaces left open by a system designed to close every gap. Kammler's power grew even as the empire it served collapsed. That paradox would define the final weeks of his visible life. He had become the man who could still make things happen in a world where almost nothing else worked. The human cost of that ability accumulated in places he rarely visited and in stories he rarely heard. The rockets flew. The jets took to the air. The underground factories continued to produce. And the man who directed it all moved through his days with the same focused attention that had carried him from the beginning, unaware that the power he had accumulated would soon prove as fleeting as the regime that had granted it. In the hidden corners of an empire built on forced hands and broken bodies, ordinary men and women carried burdens that no official report ever recorded, their private fears and small acts of defiance forming a quiet resistance that the machinery of control could never fully extinguish. Hans Kammler's growing authority had turned entire networks of camps and underground sites into a single, coordinated system of labor. What began as construction projects for the SS had expanded into the hidden production of weapons that were meant to alter the course of a war already slipping away. For the people trapped inside that system, the days unfolded in patterns of exhaustion and fear that left little room for anything else. A young man from a small Polish village, arrested for resistance activities and sent first to one camp and then another, arrived at the tunnels with the same mixture of dread and stubborn hope that had carried him through previous selections. He had already lost his father to the same machinery of arrests and transports. His mother and younger sister waited in a village that no longer felt like home. Each morning he was marched into the damp, echoing darkness where the rock walls seemed to close in around the work gangs. The air was thick with dust and the sharp smell of explosives used to blast new sections. His hands, once accustomed to farm tools, now blistered and bled from swinging a pickaxe against stone that refused to yield easily. There were moments when the sheer weight of the work threatened to break him. A fellow prisoner, an older man who had once been a teacher, noticed the way the younger man's shoulders slumped during a brief pause. Without speaking, the older man shifted his own load slightly so that a small crust of bread, saved from the previous evening's meager ration, could be passed between them. The gesture lasted only seconds. Discovery would have meant punishment for both. Yet in that brief exchange, something essential passed between them. The younger man felt a flicker of connection in a place designed to isolate every person from every other. He ate the bread slowly, letting the small nourishment steady him for the hours still ahead. Later, when the shift ended and they were herded back toward the barracks, he whispered a few words of thanks in a language the older man barely understood. The reply came in the same quiet tone. It was not the words that mattered. It was the reminder that even here, two strangers could still choose to see each other as human rather than as competitors for survival. That same impulse toward connection appeared in other corners of Kammler's domain. In one of the surface camps that fed workers into the underground factories, a woman who had been separated from her husband during an earlier transport found herself assigned to sorting debris from collapsed tunnel sections. The work was brutal and often pointless, yet it kept her alive for another day. She had managed to keep a small photograph of her children hidden in the lining of her clothing. Each evening, when the barracks grew quiet enough for private thoughts, she would take the photograph out for a few seconds and trace the faces with her finger. The children were still young when the photograph was taken. She had no way of knowing whether they were still alive or whether anyone was caring for them. The uncertainty was its own form of torment. One night, a guard who had shown occasional signs of hesitation in his duties noticed her sitting with the photograph. Instead of confiscating it or reporting her, he looked away and continued his rounds without comment. The small mercy allowed her to keep the one tangible link to the life she had lost. She never knew why the guard chose that moment to look away. She only knew that the photograph remained with her through the weeks that followed, a fragile anchor in a world that offered almost nothing else to hold on to. Stories like these rarely reached the desks where decisions about quotas and timelines were made. Kammler reviewed progress reports that spoke of meters of tunnel completed and numbers of components assembled. The language of those reports turned human endurance into measurable output. A delay caused by exhausted workers became a problem of insufficient replacements rather than a story of bodies pushed beyond their limits. When a section of tunnel collapsed and buried several prisoners, the incident appeared in the records as a temporary setback in the schedule. The names of those buried were never recorded. Their families, if they still existed somewhere, would never receive confirmation of what had happened. The system that Kammler had helped refine was designed to extract labor until nothing remained and then move on without acknowledgement. Yet inside that system, the people who were treated as resources continued to find ways to assert their own humanity. A group of prisoners in one work gang began to pass along small pieces of information about which guards were more likely to look the other way during brief rests. The information spread through whispered conversations during the march back to the barracks. It was not organized resistance in any formal sense. It was simply a way of increasing the slim chances of surviving one more day. The emotional consequences of these conditions reached far beyond the immediate suffering of those trapped inside the tunnels and camps. A letter smuggled out by a prisoner who had once worked as a clerk managed to reach a relative in a neutral country. The letter described the constant hunger, the cold that seeped through thin clothing, and the way exhaustion made even simple tasks feel impossible. It ended with a request that the relative try to find out what had happened to the writer's wife and children. The letter never reached its intended recipient in time to make a difference. It surfaced years later among other documents, a fragment of one person's attempt to maintain a connection to the world outside the barbed wire. For the families who received no letters at all, the silence created its own lasting wound. A mother in a distant village would wait at the train station for news that never came. A wife would keep a place set at the table long after hope had faded. These ripples of absence spread outward from every site Kammler's authority touched, touching people who had never seen the tunnels or the camps but who carried the consequences for the rest of their lives. There were also moments of everyday heroism that stood in quiet defiance of the system's attempt to reduce everyone to a function. In one of the assembly areas where components for the rockets were fitted together, a prisoner who had some technical training noticed that a small adjustment could be made to slow the process without immediate detection. He shared the knowledge with two others in his work group. Together they introduced tiny delays that accumulated over hours and days. The effect on overall production was negligible, yet the act itself mattered to the men who performed it. It was a way of reclaiming a small measure of agency in a situation where almost every choice had been taken from them. When the delays were eventually discovered, the three men were removed from the work gang and sent to a punishment detail. Their fate after that remained unknown to those who had worked beside them. The story of what they had tried to do circulated in whispers among the remaining prisoners, becoming one more fragment of resistance that helped others believe they were not entirely powerless. Kammler's focus on efficiency and results created the conditions in which these stories unfolded, yet the personal dimension of that efficiency rarely entered his calculations. He saw the need for more labor when output fell behind targets. He saw the value in replacing workers who could no longer meet the pace. He did not see the individual faces or hear the whispered conversations that passed between those faces during the brief moments when guards were not watching. The educational weight of his approach revealed itself in the way professional language and bureaucratic systems could transform human beings into resources while shielding those who directed the transformation from the full human reality of what they were doing. The same mindset that allowed an engineer to improve the flow of materials through a factory could be applied to improving the flow of people through a system of suffering. The difference lay not in the technical skill but in the willingness to treat lives as interchangeable parts. The unseen victims of Kammler's kingdom carried their stories forward in different ways. Some survived long enough to be liberated and spent decades trying to make sense of what they had endured. Others did not survive, and their stories lived on only in the memories of those who had shared the same tunnels or barracks. A few managed to leave behind fragments, like the letter that surfaced years later or the whispered accounts passed from one survivor to another. These fragments formed a different kind of record from the production reports that crossed Kammler's desk. They spoke of fear and exhaustion, but also of kindness offered in the narrowest of spaces and of resistance that persisted even when resistance seemed pointless. They reminded anyone who encountered them that behind every quota and every improvement there were individual lives being shaped and often destroyed by decisions made far from the places where those lives were lived. If these personal stories of endurance, quiet defiance, and the human cost behind systems of forced labor have moved you to want a tangible way to connect with and honor the individuals who lived through such times, you might find real value in exploring World War II memorabilia that lets you hold a piece of that history, or in settling in with a powerful film like Midway on Prime that brings the personal courage and sacrifice of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances to the screen in such a visceral way. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The kingdom Kammler helped build eventually collapsed along with the regime that had granted him authority. The tunnels were abandoned, the camps were liberated, and the people who had been treated as resources scattered into whatever futures remained open to them. Some carried physical scars that never fully healed. Others carried memories that shaped every relationship and every quiet moment for the rest of their lives. The small acts of kindness and the fragments of resistance that had occurred inside the machinery of control became part of a different legacy, one that survived in the stories survivors chose to tell and in the quiet dignity they preserved when everything around them was designed to strip that dignity away. Those stories stand as a reminder that even in the most tightly controlled systems, the human impulse toward connection and meaning can still find ways to assert itself. They stand as a counterweight to the efficiency that Kammler and others like him pursued, a reminder that behind every blueprint and every quota there were lives that could never be fully reduced to numbers on a page. In the final months of a regime that was visibly coming apart at every seam, one man still moved through the wreckage issuing orders as if the power to command could somehow hold the fragments of his own creation together. Hans Kammler had spent years building systems that delivered results under pressure. Now the pressure came from every direction at once. Reports arrived daily of lost territory, destroyed facilities, and advancing armies that no longer respected the old lines of control. He read each dispatch with the same steady attention he had always given to production quotas, but the numbers told a story he could no longer reshape through efficiency alone. The underground factories that had once seemed protected were now vulnerable. The personnel he had moved and protected were scattered. The scientists whose expertise he had claimed were beginning to look for ways to slip the net he had drawn around them. Kammler responded by issuing new orders for evacuation and consolidation. He directed key technicians and documents toward locations in the southern mountains, places the leadership still spoke of as a final redoubt. He arranged for selected prisoners and forced laborers to be moved with the projects, calculating that their skills might still be needed even as the larger war slipped away. The orders carried the same tone of calm authority he had used when his power was at its peak. Only the circumstances had changed. The scientists who had worked under his control for months felt the shift in atmosphere almost immediately. Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger had already navigated the uneasy alliance with Kammler. Now they faced a new calculation. The man who had once demanded speed and results was now demanding movement and concealment. Von Braun received instructions to prepare teams and materials for relocation. He understood that the orders came with an implicit threat. Those who hesitated or sought other paths risked being treated as obstacles rather than assets. In quiet conversations with Dornberger, von Braun weighed the risks of continuing under Kammler's direction against the possibility of surrender or escape. Neither man spoke openly of desertion. The habit of professional loyalty still held, even as the ground beneath that loyalty dissolved. Yet both carried private fears that surfaced in small ways. Von Braun began to keep certain technical notes separate from the official records, creating a private cache that might prove useful if the current authority collapsed. Dornberger used his military rank to arrange limited protections for core team members, quietly moving families or personal documents when opportunities appeared. These were not dramatic acts of resistance. They were the small, calculated steps of men who sensed that the future no longer belonged to the system they had served. Kammler himself felt the narrowing of options in ways he rarely acknowledged even to his closest aides. He had built his career on the ability to deliver measurable outcomes. Now the outcomes he could still control existed inside a larger collapse he could not prevent. When a subordinate reported that one of the underground sites had been partially overrun and that valuable equipment had been lost, Kammler listened without visible reaction. He issued orders to destroy what remained and to accelerate the movement of personnel to the next location. The subordinate left the meeting with the clear understanding that failure would not be met with sympathy. Later that evening, the same subordinate wrote a brief note to his wife describing the pressure of constant movement and the sense that every decision carried heavier consequences than before. He did not mention Kammler by name. The note was never sent. It remained among his papers, a private record of a man who had learned to carry out orders while quietly preparing for the moment when those orders might no longer protect him. There were moments when the human reality of these last-ditch efforts revealed itself through small, telling interactions. In one of the relocation convoys moving south, a group of technicians and selected prisoners traveled together under guard. Among them was a young engineer who had once worked on rocket components and a prisoner who had been forced to assemble those same components in the tunnels. They recognized each other from earlier sights. During a brief stop, when the guards were occupied with other matters, the engineer passed a small piece of bread to the prisoner. The gesture was quick and wordless. It carried the risk of punishment for both if discovered. Yet it happened because even in the midst of a collapsing system, two men who had been placed on opposite sides of power could still choose a moment of shared humanity. The prisoner accepted the bread without speaking. Later, when the convoy resumed its journey, he kept the memory of that small kindness as a private anchor. It did not change his circumstances. It did not alter the larger machinery that had brought them both to this point. But it reminded him that the system had not yet succeeded in erasing every trace of connection between people. Kammler's efforts to hold his projects together also created new forms of separation and loss. Families that had been moved with key personnel found themselves in unfamiliar locations with uncertain futures. A wife who had followed her husband south received no clear information about what would happen next or whether the work would continue long enough to justify the displacement. She managed the daily routines of caring for children in a place that offered little stability. Her private fears centered on the possibility that the man she waited for might not return, or that the authority that had once protected them might turn against them if the larger collapse accelerated. These fears were rarely spoken aloud. They appeared in the careful way she conserved food and in the quiet conversations she had with other women in similar circumstances. The emotional cost of these displacements accumulated in places Kammler never visited. He saw only the movement of essential personnel and equipment. The human stories attached to those movements remained outside the frame of his calculations. There were also instances of quiet resistance that emerged in the final weeks of organized control. A clerk in one of Kammler's administrative offices began to misfile certain documents related to prisoner transfers, creating small delays that allowed a few individuals to avoid immediate relocation to more dangerous sites. The clerk justified the action to himself as a minor correction rather than outright defiance. He knew that discovery would end his own position and possibly his life. The risk felt worth taking because it offered a slim chance of mercy in a system that had grown increasingly merciless. Similar small acts occurred among guards and lower-level staff who sensed that the authority they served was no longer absolute. A guard might look the other way when a prisoner slipped away during a chaotic transfer. Another might pass along a warning about an upcoming inspection. These moments did not slow the larger machinery of evacuation and destruction. They did, however, preserve fragments of individual choice in a time when most choices had been removed. Kammler continued to issue orders even as the circle of territory under his effective control shrank. He arranged for the destruction of records and equipment that could not be moved. He directed selected scientists and technicians toward locations where they might still be useful if a final stand materialized. The scientists themselves began to make their own private calculations. Von Braun and his closest colleagues discussed the possibility of surrender to advancing American forces rather than continuing under SS direction. They framed these discussions in terms of preserving the technical work rather than personal survival. The distinction allowed them to maintain a sense of professional continuity even as they prepared to step outside the authority that had claimed them. Kammler sensed the shifting loyalties but lacked the resources to enforce complete control. His power had always depended on the larger system's ability to back his orders with consequences. As that system dissolved, the scientists and technicians under his nominal authority gained new room to maneuver. The fragments Kammler tried to hold together began to slip from his grasp one by one. The emotional weight of these final efforts rested heavily on everyone involved. Kammler carried the burden of a man who had built his identity around the ability to deliver results and now faced a situation where results no longer mattered in the old way. The scientists carried the burden of having served a system whose methods they had increasingly come to question. The prisoners and forced laborers carried the burden of survival in a world where survival itself had become a daily negotiation. Small moments of kindness continued to appear in the narrow spaces between orders and chaos. A technician might share a hidden piece of food with a prisoner during a transfer. A clerk might quietly alter a list to spare one more person from immediate danger. These acts did not change the outcome of the larger collapse. They did, however, stand as quiet assertions that even in the final stages of a system built on control and efficiency, the human impulse toward connection and mercy could still find expression. If the raw, desperate human stories of these last frantic efforts to hold power and projects together have left you wanting to see what the official records and carefully managed narratives never showed, there are collections of unseen, raw images and footage from that time that reveal the harsh, uncensored realities behind the uniforms and the orders. You can find them through a secure digital product made available for those who want the unfiltered visual record. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Kammler's final orders carried the same tone of authority that had defined his rise. He directed the movement of people and materials as if the future still belonged to the men who could still command. Yet each order existed inside a larger reality that no command could alter. The scientists he had once controlled began to look for paths that led away from his authority. The prisoners and laborers who had sustained his projects endured the chaos of movement and abandonment. The fragments of the empire he had built scattered across the collapsing landscape. Kammler himself continued to move between locations, issuing directives and receiving reports, until the moment when even his own movements became part of the larger dissolution. The power he had accumulated proved as temporary as the regime that had granted it. What remained were the human stories of those who had been caught inside his systems, the small acts of connection they had preserved, and the private fears and calculations that had shaped their final weeks under his control. Those stories would continue long after the last orders were given and the last fragments had slipped beyond any single man's ability to hold them together. In the final days of a war that had already decided its own ending, a man who had spent years building systems of control found himself moving through the same chaos he had once believed he could master, until the moment when even his own path disappeared into the confusion of collapsing fronts and scattered convoys. Hans Kammler had issued his last orders with the same measured tone he had always used. He directed remaining personnel and selected equipment toward locations that no longer offered real safety. The underground factories he had once overseen were now behind advancing lines or reduced to rubble. The scientists who had worked under his authority were already making their own calculations about survival. Kammler himself moved between temporary headquarters, sometimes traveling with a small group of aides and sometimes separating from them to attend to matters that remained private. The roads were crowded with retreating soldiers, civilian refugees, and the remnants of units that no longer answered to any central command. In that disorder, a single man could still issue directives, but the directives no longer carried the weight they once had. The power that had defined his rise now existed only in the narrow space between one order and the next. His driver, a man who had served him through the final months of organized control, noticed the change in the general's manner during those last journeys. Kammler spoke less than usual. When he did speak, it was often to confirm routes or to ask whether certain documents had been secured. The driver sensed a private tension that had not been present in earlier months. He did not ask questions. Loyalty in that environment meant carrying out instructions without requiring explanations. Yet he observed the way Kammler sometimes stared out at the passing landscape as if measuring distances that no longer mattered. There were moments when the general seemed to weigh options that he did not share. The driver kept those observations to himself, filing them away with the same quiet discipline he had learned while serving a man who valued results above conversation. One of the last recorded movements took Kammler toward a location where his wife had been staying. The visit, if it occurred, was brief. He arrived with a small escort and left again within hours. Those who were present later recalled that he appeared focused rather than emotional. He spoke of arrangements that needed to be made and of people who required protection. There was no extended farewell, no visible display of the personal stakes that must have accompanied such a moment. Yet in the private space between a man and his family in the final days of a collapsing world, even brief words carried layers of meaning that no outsider could fully interpret. The driver waited outside during the visit. He did not know what was said inside. He only knew that when Kammler returned to the vehicle, the general's expression had settled back into the same controlled mask he had worn through years of difficult decisions. The convoy that left that location moved through territory that changed hands almost daily. Allied forces were advancing from multiple directions. German units were fragmenting or surrendering. In the confusion, maintaining contact between vehicles became difficult. At one point the convoy separated. Kammler's car continued with a smaller group while other vehicles took different routes or were delayed by damaged roads and checkpoints. The driver stayed with Kammler. He had been given clear instructions to remain with the general until further notice. Those instructions no longer came with the certainty of a larger command structure. They were now the personal directives of a man whose authority existed only in the immediate moment. There were brief stops along the way. At one of them, Kammler spoke with a subordinate who had been sent ahead to arrange the next stage of movement. The conversation was short and practical. Kammler asked about the status of certain personnel and whether routes remained open. The subordinate answered with the precision expected of someone who had learned to deliver information without elaboration. Neither man mentioned the larger collapse that was happening around them. They spoke instead of the next destination and the next set of arrangements. When the conversation ended, Kammler returned to the vehicle. The driver noticed that the general seemed to carry the weight of decisions that could no longer guarantee any particular outcome. The driver did not comment. He simply waited for the next instruction and followed it when it came. The separation that would define the mystery occurred during one of these movements through contested ground. The exact circumstances remain unclear because the accounts that survive contradict one another. What is known is that at some point Kammler was no longer with the main group. The driver later described a moment when the general left the vehicle to speak with another officer or to check a route. The driver waited as instructed. When Kammler did not return within the expected time, the driver searched briefly and then made the decision to continue with the remaining instructions he had been given. Whether that decision was made under direct order or under the pressure of the surrounding chaos is one of the details that different witnesses remembered differently. The driver himself carried the memory of that moment for the rest of his life. He had served a man who demanded loyalty and results. In the final separation, he had been left with neither a clear order nor a clear explanation. For those who had worked closely with Kammler in the preceding weeks, the news of his disappearance arrived in fragments. A subordinate at one location received word that the general had not arrived at the expected destination. Another aide heard conflicting reports about whether Kammler had been captured, had chosen to separate from his escort, or had simply vanished into the disorder of retreating columns. None of the reports could be verified. The same man who had once controlled the movement of thousands now became the subject of uncertain rumors passed between people who no longer shared a common chain of command. The uncertainty itself became part of the story. In a time when so many lives were ending in documented violence or recorded surrender, the absence of any confirmed ending for Kammler created a space that different people filled with different possibilities. The driver who had been with him during those final movements carried his own private burden. He had followed orders through months of increasing pressure. He had witnessed the general's growing isolation without ever being invited to comment on it. When the separation occurred, the driver was left with the knowledge that he had been the last person in a position to know Kammler's immediate intentions. That knowledge brought no comfort. It brought only the responsibility of living with an incomplete story. In later years, when he was asked to recall those days, the driver described the moment of separation with careful precision. He did not claim to know what had happened after he drove away. He only described what he had seen and what he had been told to do. The restraint in his account reflected the same discipline that had defined his service. It also left room for the questions that no single witness could answer. There were other people whose lives intersected with Kammler's final movements in smaller but equally human ways. A local farmer whose land lay along one of the routes taken by the convoy later recalled seeing a group of vehicles stop briefly near his property. He noticed an officer who seemed to be in charge speaking with another man before the vehicles continued. The farmer did not know the officer's name or rank. He only remembered that the man appeared focused and that the conversation ended quickly. Years later, when investigators asked about that day, the farmer repeated the same small details. They were the only fragments he had to offer. In the larger mystery of Kammler's disappearance, such fragments became part of the incomplete record that historians and investigators would continue to examine. The educational weight of these final hours lies in the way individual choices and uncertainties multiply when larger systems collapse. Kammler had spent years building structures that rewarded precision and punished hesitation. In the end, the precision he had cultivated could not prevent the moment when even his own path became uncertain. The people around him, his driver, his aides, the scientists who had worked under his direction, each carried fragments of the story. None of them held the complete picture. The absence of a confirmed ending turned what might have been a documented conclusion into an open question that would persist for decades. That persistence itself reveals something about how power and mystery interact when the records of a collapsing regime are incomplete by design or by circumstance. The driver continued his journey after the separation, following the last instructions he had received. He reached the location where other personnel had gathered and reported what had happened. The response he received was confusion rather than clarity. No one could confirm whether Kammler had been captured, had chosen to disappear, or had met some other fate in the chaos between the lines. The driver was eventually questioned by Allied investigators who were interested in the movements of high-ranking SS officers. He answered their questions with the same careful restraint he had shown throughout his service. He described the routes, the stops, and the moment of separation. He did not speculate about what had happened afterward. The investigators noted his account and moved on to other witnesses. The driver returned to a life that would always contain that unfinished chapter. If the quiet uncertainties and personal burdens carried by those who stood closest to Kammler in his final hours have reminded you how much dedicated effort goes into piecing together the human fragments of history's most elusive endings, then you understand why these stories depend on people who believe in keeping the record alive. If you found value in the care we take to bring these moments into clearer view, a small tip, even as little as $1, through Ko-Fi helps support the research and the time that makes such work possible. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the days and weeks that followed the separation, the story of Kammler's disappearance spread through the scattered remnants of the system he had served. Different versions emerged depending on who was telling the story and what they hoped or feared the outcome might be. Some accounts suggested he had taken his own life rather than face capture. Others claimed he had been shot by his own men or by advancing forces. Still others proposed that he had been taken into custody by one of the Allied powers and that his fate had been deliberately kept from public record. None of these versions could be confirmed with evidence that satisfied everyone who examined them. The body was never recovered. The documents that might have clarified his final intentions were either destroyed or never existed in the first place. What remained was the fact of his absence and the human stories of those who had been with him in the hours before that absence became permanent. The driver who had served through those final movements lived with the knowledge that he had been the last person to receive direct instructions from Kammler. He carried that knowledge without claiming to understand its full meaning. In the years that followed, when he was asked to recount those days, he repeated the same details with the same careful precision. He described the routes, the stops, and the moment when the general left the vehicle and did not return. He did not fill in the gaps with speculation. The restraint itself became part of the story. It reflected the discipline of a man who had learned to serve without requiring complete explanations. It also left the larger mystery intact for those who would continue to examine the fragments long after the war had ended. The final convoy that had once moved with purpose under Kammler's direction scattered into the larger disorder of May 1945. Some vehicles reached their intended destinations. Others were overtaken or abandoned. The people who had traveled in those vehicles carried their own memories of the final days. For most of them, those memories eventually became part of larger stories of survival and reconstruction. For the driver who had stayed with Kammler until the separation, the memory remained sharper and more incomplete. He had followed a man who valued control and results. In the end, he had been left with neither. The absence of a confirmed ending turned what might have been a simple conclusion into a question that would continue to echo through the historical record. That echo would shape the way later generations understood the final hours of a man who had once believed he could shape outcomes through the force of his own will and the systems he had built to serve it. In the fog that settled over the final hours of a collapsing front, a single separation on a contested road turned one man's disappearance into a knot of conflicting stories that no single witness could fully untie. The driver who had stayed with Hans Kammler through the last movements later described the moment with careful precision. They had stopped near a cluster of vehicles and damaged buildings. Kammler stepped out to speak with another officer or to check a route that had become uncertain in the shifting lines. The driver waited as he had been instructed to do through months of similar stops. When the general did not return within the expected time, the driver searched the immediate area and then made the decision to continue with the remaining instructions he carried. He did not see what happened after that point. He only knew that the man he had served had stepped away from the vehicle and had not come back. That simple fact became the starting point for every later account, and every later account added its own layer of detail or interpretation. One version that circulated among those who had been part of the scattered remnants described Kammler choosing to end his own life rather than face capture or the collapse of everything he had helped build. In this telling, he walked a short distance from the road, perhaps into a wooded area or behind a ruined structure, and used the pistol he carried. The driver and others who had been nearby heard or were later told of a single shot. Some accounts added the detail that Kammler had given his driver or an adjutant instructions about what to do afterward, instructions that included arranging for his family to receive confirmation of his death so that practical matters such as pensions could be settled. These details carried the weight of a man who had spent his adult life managing outcomes and who wanted even his final act to be handled with a measure of order. Another account, offered by different witnesses in the immediate aftermath, suggested that Kammler had been shot by one of his own men during a moment of tension or panic. In this version, the separation from the main group had created confusion about who still held authority. An adjutant or a lower-ranking officer, perhaps fearing that continuing with Kammler would lead to capture or punishment, chose to act. The shot was described as sudden, the result of a quick decision made under pressure rather than a planned execution. Those who told this story often added that the body was left where it fell or was moved only far enough to avoid immediate discovery by advancing forces. The driver who had been with Kammler heard versions of this account later and rejected them, insisting that he had seen no sign of conflict or threat in the moments before the separation. The contradiction between his memory and the memories of others became one of the first fractures in the record. A third strand of testimony described Kammler being killed during a brief skirmish with advancing troops or with local forces who had turned against the retreating Germans. In this telling, the general had attempted to continue moving toward a safer location when the small group he traveled with encountered resistance. The fighting was described as chaotic and short. Kammler was said to have been hit in the exchange. Those who survived the encounter scattered, and the body was never recovered by anyone who could later give a clear report. This version aligned with the general disorder of the roads in those final days, when armed groups from multiple sides moved through the same territory with little coordination. It also carried the emotional weight of a man who had lived by the structures of command dying in a moment when those structures no longer held. The driver who had been closest to Kammler during the last hours carried the burden of these conflicting accounts for the rest of his life. He had followed orders through years of increasing pressure. He had witnessed the general's growing isolation without ever being invited into the private calculations that shaped it. When the separation occurred, he was left with the knowledge that he had been the last person in a position to know Kammler's immediate intentions. Later, when Allied investigators questioned him, he repeated the same careful description of the route, the stop, and the moment when Kammler left the vehicle. He did not speculate about what had happened afterward. He answered only what he had seen and what he had been told to do. The restraint in his testimony reflected the discipline he had learned while serving a man who valued precision. It also left the larger mystery intact for those who would continue to examine the fragments. Kammler's wife, who had received a brief visit from him in the days before the separation, faced her own private reckoning. She had managed the household through years of his rising responsibilities and the increasing distance that came with them. When word reached her that he was missing and presumed dead, she began the practical process of having him declared deceased so that she and their children could access whatever support remained available. She contacted former colleagues and subordinates, asking for statements that might confirm the date and circumstances. Some of those she approached offered versions that aligned with the suicide account. Others provided conflicting details that only deepened the uncertainty. She gathered what she could and presented it to the authorities who handled such matters in the immediate post-war period. The process was not only about legal closure. It was also about the emotional need to mark an ending, even when the evidence remained incomplete. There were small moments embedded in these larger uncertainties that revealed the human texture of the final hours. One account mentioned that Kammler had carried a small packet of documents or personal items with him during the last movements. Whether those items were destroyed, lost, or taken by someone else remained unknown. Another fragment described a brief conversation between Kammler and a subordinate in which the general asked whether certain arrangements for his family had been confirmed. The subordinate answered that they had. The exchange was ordinary in its phrasing, yet carried the weight of a man who knew he might not have another opportunity to ask. These fragments survived in the memories of those who were present and were later repeated when investigators or historians sought to reconstruct the sequence of events. The conflicting stories created a web of possibilities that no single narrative could contain. Each version carried its own emotional logic. The suicide account allowed those who had served Kammler to see his final act as one of control, consistent with the way he had lived. The account of being shot by his own men reflected the fear and fragmentation that defined the last days for many who had held positions of authority. The version of death in a skirmish aligned with the general chaos of the roads and the likelihood that any armed group moving through contested ground could encounter violence. None of these versions could be proven or disproven with evidence that satisfied everyone who examined them. The absence of a recovered body and the destruction or loss of many records meant that the truth remained distributed across partial memories and incomplete documents. Investigators who questioned witnesses in the months and years after the war encountered the same fractures. Some of those questioned had clear reasons to shape their accounts in particular ways. Others simply remembered events differently because the chaos of those days had blurred the sequence. The driver's testimony remained one of the most consistent threads, yet even his careful description left room for the possibility that something had happened in the moments after Kammler left the vehicle. Other witnesses offered details that could not be reconciled with the driver's memory. The result was a record that contained multiple truths rather than a single agreed-upon ending. The educational weight of these conflicting deaths lies in the way individual memories and loyalties shape the historical record when larger systems collapse. Kammler had spent his career inside structures that rewarded clear chains of command and measurable outcomes. In the final hours, those structures dissolved. What remained were the personal accounts of people who had been close to him and who each carried their own reasons for remembering events in particular ways. The driver's restraint reflected loyalty and discipline. The wife's efforts to secure a declaration of death reflected practical need and emotional closure. The varying accounts from other witnesses reflected the fear, confusion, and self-protection that defined survival in those final days. None of these human responses could be separated from the larger story of how power and uncertainty interact when records become incomplete. The driver who had been with Kammler until the separation lived with the knowledge that his testimony would be examined and re-examined by those seeking answers. He answered questions when they were asked and otherwise returned to a life that contained that unfinished chapter. In later years, when historians or investigators contacted him again, he repeated the same careful description. He did not add details he had not witnessed. He did not claim certainty about what had happened after the separation. The consistency of his account became one of the anchors in a sea of conflicting possibilities. It also left the central question open, whether Kammler had chosen his own ending, had been ended by someone else, or had simply vanished into the disorder that swallowed so many lives in those final weeks. If these conflicting accounts and the personal burdens they carried have left you wanting to explore the gray areas and human complexities of such endings more deeply with others who share the same curiosity, then you'll find real value in joining a community of history lovers who gather for uncensored conversations and raw explorations of the past. My Patreon offers free podcasts, unblurred video sections, and a space where we can go further into these stories together without the filters that sometimes soften the truth. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The stories of Kammler's final hours continued to circulate long after the immediate post-war period. Different versions served different purposes for those who told them. Some used the suicide account to emphasize the general's control even at the end. Others used the account of being shot by his own men to highlight the breakdown of loyalty inside the collapsing system. Still others accepted the possibility of death in a skirmish as the most likely outcome given the conditions on the roads. None of these versions could claim exclusive truth because the evidence remained incomplete. What endured was the human reality that a man who had once commanded significant authority had stepped away from a vehicle on a contested road and had not returned, leaving behind a web of memories, contradictions, and unanswered questions that would shape the way his story was understood for decades afterward. The driver who had waited and then continued carried one thread of that story. The wife who sought closure carried another. The witnesses who offered conflicting details carried still others. Together they formed a record that was less about a single confirmed death and more about the way uncertainty itself becomes part of the historical legacy when larger structures fall apart. In the months after the guns fell silent, while the world tried to measure what had been lost and what might still be salvaged, certain men in uniform began to ask not only where Hans Kammler had gone, but whether he might still be found alive and brought in for questions that had nothing to do with the courtroom. The Allied armies that overran the last pockets of resistance carried with them lists of names. Some of those names belonged to men who would be tried for crimes that had no statute of limitations. Others belonged to men whose knowledge of tunnels, factories, and weapons programs made them valuable in ways that complicated the simpler story of justice. Kammler's name appeared on both kinds of lists. The prosecutors preparing cases for Nuremberg wanted him because of his role in the construction of camps and the use of forced labor. Intelligence officers from the United States wanted him for reasons that were never fully shared with the prosecutors. They had seen the underground installations he had helped create and the speed with which production had been moved and hidden. They understood that the man who had organized those movements might still hold information about sites that had not yet been discovered, about methods that had not yet been studied, and about personnel whose skills could be turned to new purposes in a world that was already rearranging itself around new rivalries. The driver who had been with Kammler in the final days was questioned more than once by men who wore American uniforms and spoke with quiet persistence. They asked about routes, about documents that might have been carried, about conversations that might have revealed where Kammler intended to go if the convoy separated. The driver answered with the same careful restraint he had shown since the moment of separation. He described what he had seen and what he had been told to do. He did not speculate. The investigators listened and took notes and then asked the same questions again in slightly different ways, as if they hoped that repetition might loosen a detail that had been held back. The driver noticed that their interest did not seem to center on the camps or the labor. It centered on the factories that had been carved into mountains and the speed with which equipment and people had been moved when the surface installations became vulnerable. That focus told him something about the men who were asking. They were not only looking for a war criminal. They were looking for a resource. There were other witnesses who felt the same shift in emphasis. A technician who had worked in one of the underground sites was located in a displaced persons camp and brought to a temporary headquarters for questioning. The Americans who spoke with him wanted to know about the layout of the tunnels, about how quickly sections could be reinforced or abandoned, about which engineers had been considered essential enough to be moved with the equipment. The technician answered as best he could, but he also noticed that the questions avoided certain topics. No one asked him to describe the conditions under which the work had been done or the faces of the men who had died in the tunnels. The absence of those questions was its own kind of answer. The men across the table were not collecting evidence for a trial. They were collecting information that might still be useful in a world where new tunnels and new factories might need to be built quickly and in secret. Kammler's wife, who had already begun the process of having him declared dead so that she and her children could move forward, found herself drawn into this same current of interest. Investigators visited her with questions that went beyond the confirmation of a date or a location. They wanted to know whether her husband had ever spoken of particular projects in ways that might reveal hidden sites or hidden methods. They asked whether he had kept personal papers that had not been turned over to authorities. She answered with the same mixture of grief and practicality that had carried her through the immediate post-war months. She had her own reasons for wanting clarity. A declaration of death would allow her to claim whatever support remained available. Yet she also understood that the men who came to her with questions were not primarily concerned with her practical needs. They were concerned with what her husband might still know if he were still alive somewhere. The possibility that Kammler might be alive and in custody somewhere created its own quiet tension among those who had worked closest to him. The scientists who had been part of the rocket program and who were now being courted by American and British recruiters heard rumors that the man who had once controlled their labor might still be available for questioning. Some of them felt a private unease at the thought. They had already begun to separate their technical achievements from the conditions under which those achievements had been realized. If Kammler were brought in and asked to describe the full cost of the production he had overseen, the separation might become harder to maintain. Others felt a different kind of unease. If Kammler were alive and cooperating with the Americans, he might be able to shape the narrative of who had been essential and who had been expendable. That possibility carried implications for their own post-war positions and for the stories they would be allowed to tell about their work. There were small moments that revealed how these larger calculations touched individual lives. A former aide who had carried messages for Kammler in the final weeks was located in a prisoner of war camp and questioned about whether the general had ever mentioned specific locations in the southern mountains or in Austria. The aide answered that he had not been told such details. He was then asked whether he himself might be willing to return to certain sites to help identify what had been left behind. The question was framed as an opportunity rather than a demand. The aide understood that cooperation might improve his own. situation. He also understood that the men asking the question were not primarily interested in bringing anyone to justice for what had happened inside those sites. They were interested in what could still be learned from the sites themselves. The driver who had been with Kammler until the separation continued to live with the knowledge that his testimony was being examined from more than one angle. The investigators who spoke with him sometimes asked about the general's state of mind in the final days. They wanted to know whether Kammler had seemed resigned or determined, whether he had spoken of surrender or of continuing the work in some other form. The driver answered that Kammler had continued to issue orders and to expect those orders to be carried out. He did not add his own interpretation of what that might have meant. The investigators took notes and moved on. Later, when the driver was alone, he sometimes wondered whether the questions about state of mind were really about Kammler or whether they were about something else entirely, something the investigators already knew or suspected but could not yet confirm. The educational weight of this post-war interest lies in the way victors sometimes choose knowledge over immediate accountability when the knowledge seems to offer strategic advantage in a world that has not yet finished rearranging itself. The same armies that had fought to destroy the regime Kammler served now found themselves sifting through its remnants for anything that might still be useful. Underground factories that had been built with forced labor became potential models for new construction. Engineers who had worked under brutal conditions became potential recruits for new programs. The man who had organized so much of that activity became a person of interest not because of what he had done to others, but because of what he might still be able to explain or replicate. That choice carried consequences that reached beyond any single interrogation. It shaped the stories that would be told and the stories that would be allowed to remain hidden. It created space for some men to be brought into new laboratories and new projects while others disappeared into the same uncertainty that had swallowed Kammler. There were moments when the human cost of that choice became visible in small, personal ways. A scientist who had been offered a position in the United States received a letter from a colleague who had remained in Europe. The letter described the ongoing searches for men like Kammler in the sense that some questions about the past were being set aside in favor of questions about the future. The scientist read the letter and then put it away. He had already begun to focus on the work that lay ahead. The past was a territory he preferred not to revisit in detail. Yet the letter stayed with him, a reminder that the choices being made in the name of progress carried their own quiet costs. If these hidden layers of interest, the quiet calculations that turned a war criminal into a potential asset and turned the search for justice into a search for knowledge, have stirred your curiosity about the secret operations and overlooked personal stories that shaped the world after the guns fell silent, then you'll find real value in the free ebook The Shadow War: 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, which uncovers espionage, forgotten facts, and the hidden heroes whose quiet actions made a difference even in the most complicated chapters. You can receive it along with weekly deep dives by signing up through the secure link in the description below. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The interest in Kammler did not end with the immediate post-war months. It continued in the form of ongoing inquiries and occasional reports that surfaced in intelligence files. Some of those reports suggested that he had been located and questioned. Others suggested that he had been offered terms in exchange for cooperation. Still others simply noted that the search continued because the information he might possess had not yet been fully accounted for. None of these reports reached the public record in a way that resolved the central question. The man who had once commanded significant authority within a collapsing system had become a variable in calculations that extended beyond the war he had served. The driver who had been with him until the separation continued to answer questions when they were asked. The wife who had sought a declaration of death continued to navigate the practical and emotional consequences of uncertainty. The scientists who had worked under Kammler's direction continued to build new lives in new laboratories, carrying with them the knowledge of what had been required to reach those laboratories. The interest in Kammler alive was never only about one man. It was about the larger choice between accounting for the past and preparing for a future in which the lessons of that past might be set aside in favor of whatever knowledge could still be extracted from it. That choice would continue to shape the stories that were told and the stories that were allowed to remain hidden long after the final questions had been asked and the final reports had been filed. In the months after the war ended, when the dust had barely settled over ruined cities and the first trials were beginning in Nuremberg, rumors began to drift through the displaced persons camps and the makeshift offices of Allied investigators. They spoke of a high-ranking SS officer who had vanished from a contested road and reappeared, in whispers, on the other side of the ocean or deep in the shadows of South American ports. Hans Kammler had stepped away from a vehicle in the final days of May 1945 and had not returned. The official accounts that reached his wife described a suicide. Yet in the informal networks that carried news among those who had served in the same collapsing system, other possibilities circulated. Some said he had been taken by the Americans before any public record could be made. Others claimed he had slipped through the same informal routes that allowed other high-ranking officials to reach Argentina or Paraguay, protected by sympathetic officials and old contacts who still believed in the cause or simply saw profit in helping men disappear. The stories varied in detail, but they shared a common thread. The man who had once commanded underground factories and rocket production had not simply ended his life on a Bohemian roadside. He had traded what he knew for the chance to keep living. The driver who had been with Kammler until the moment of separation heard some of these rumors later, when he was questioned by investigators who seemed less interested in confirming a death than in tracing a possible survival. The driver answered only what he had seen. He described the stop, the brief conversation, and the moment when the general walked away from the vehicle. He did not know whether Kammler had been captured, had chosen to disappear, or had met some other end. Yet the questions he faced suggested that others believed Kammler might still be alive and that his knowledge of hidden installations and rapid production methods remained valuable even after the fighting had stopped. The driver carried the weight of that possibility without ever knowing whether it was true. It added another layer to the unfinished chapter he had already been living with since the separation. Kammler's wife, who had petitioned to have him declared dead so that she and their children could move forward, found herself caught between the official story and the quieter rumors that reached her through former colleagues. She had her own reasons for wanting closure. A legal declaration would allow practical arrangements for the family. Yet she also understood that if her husband had survived and was being protected somewhere, the declaration she sought might never fully resolve the uncertainty. She gathered statements from those who had been nearby in the final days and presented them to the authorities. Some of those statements aligned with the suicide account. Others were vaguer, leaving room for the possibility that Kammler had been taken into custody by one of the victorious powers. She did not know which version to believe. She only knew that the man she had lived with had disappeared, and the world that remained offered conflicting explanations that served different interests. There were scientists who had worked under Kammler's authority during the final months who now found themselves in a different position. Some of them, including Werner von Braun and members of his team, were being approached by American recruiters who offered new lives and new laboratories in exchange for their technical knowledge. These men had already begun to separate their engineering achievements from the conditions under which those achievements had been realized. They spoke of reaching the stars and of peaceful exploration. They did not speak of the tunnels where forced labor had made rapid production possible. If Kammler had been taken by the same Americans who were now courting the rocket scientists, the separation between technical skill and human cost might become even harder to maintain. A man who had once controlled the labor force could describe exactly how that labor had been organized and what it had cost. That description, if it existed, remained hidden from public view. The possibility that Kammler had been protected in exchange for information created its own quiet moral tension among those who had survived the system he helped run. A former technician who had worked in one of the underground factories heard rumors that the general had been offered safety in return for details about hidden sites and production methods. The technician had seen men die in those tunnels. He had carried the memory of their faces through the final months of the war and into the displaced persons' camps. The thought that the man who had set the quotas might now be living under a new name, protected by the same victors who were trying some of his colleagues for crimes against humanity, carried a weight that no official announcement could lift. The technician did not speak of this openly. He answered questions when investigators found him and then returned to the slow work of rebuilding a life that had been interrupted by forces larger than any single person. There were also accounts that placed Kammler on a different path entirely. Some who had been part of the scattered remnants of the SS spoke of networks that helped high-ranking officials reach South America. These networks, later called Rattlins, were said to involve sympathetic officials in the Vatican and in certain neutral countries who arranged travel documents and safe passage for men who could pay or who carried useful information. In these versions of the story, Kammler had used his knowledge of underground construction and rapid industrial relocation to negotiate his way out of Europe. He had not simply vanished into suicide or American custody. He had been helped to disappear because what he knew remained valuable to people who were not interested in bringing him to trial. These accounts were difficult to verify. They circulated among those who had reason to believe that the old system had not entirely collapsed and that some of its members might still find protection in distant places. The human cost of these possibilities reached beyond Kammler himself. His wife and children lived with the uncertainty of not knowing whether he had died on a roadside or had begun a new life under a different name. The families of those who had died in the tunnels and camps he had helped organize received no additional closure from rumors that the man responsible might still be alive somewhere. Investigators who had been tasked with locating war criminals found their work complicated by the possibility that some of the men they sought had already been claimed by other agencies for other purposes. The driver who had stayed with Kammler until the separation carried the private knowledge that he had been the last person to receive direct instructions. If Kammler had survived and was living under protection, that knowledge placed an additional burden on the driver's memory. He had followed orders through years of pressure. He had been left with an incomplete story that others might still be using for purposes he could not control. There were small moments that revealed how these larger uncertainties touched individual lives in quieter ways. A former subordinate who had carried messages for Kammler in the final weeks received a letter years later from someone who claimed to have seen the general in South America. The letter was brief and offered no proof. It described a man who kept to himself and who seemed to carry the weight of decisions made long ago. The subordinate did not know whether to believe the letter or to treat it as another rumor born of wishful thinking or deliberate misinformation. He kept the letter among his private papers, a fragment of a story that refused to resolve itself into a single clear ending. The educational weight of these rumors and possibilities lies in the way victors sometimes choose to protect knowledge and expertise even when that protection comes at the cost of accountability. The same powers that had fought to destroy the regime Kammler served found themselves weighing the value of his technical understanding against the moral claim of those who had suffered under the system he helped build. Some men who had been part of that system were brought into new laboratories and new projects. Others disappeared into uncertain fates. The choice between these outcomes was not always made in public view. It happened in the quiet spaces where intelligence officers and recruiters made calculations about what the future might require and what the past could be allowed to remain hidden. If these hidden paths and the personal stories attached to them have stirred your curiosity about the human complexities that followed the end of the fighting, you might find real value in exploring World War II memorabilia that lets you hold a tangible connection to that era, or in settling in with a powerful film like Midway on Prime that brings the courage and sacrifice of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances to the screen in such a visceral way. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The rumors about Kammler's survival never settled into a single confirmed narrative. Some investigators continue to believe he had died in the final days of May 1945, either by his own hand or in the chaos of the collapsing front. Others kept files open because the possibility that he had been taken into custody or had escaped through informal networks could not be entirely dismissed. The driver who had been with him until the separation answered questions when they were asked and otherwise returned to a life that contained that unfinished chapter. Kammler's wife continued to navigate the practical and emotional consequences of uncertainty. The scientists who had worked under his direction continued to build new lives, some in new countries, carrying with them the knowledge of what had been required to reach those new lives. The possibility that Kammler had traded what he knew for the chance to keep living remained one of the open questions that lingered in the shadow of the war's end. It did not change the suffering that had already occurred in the tunnels and camps. It did not bring additional justice to those who had died or to the families who had been left behind. It simply added another layer to the story of a man who had once believed he could shape outcomes through the force of his own will and the systems he had built to serve it. That layer would continue to shape the way later generations understood the choices made in the name of survival and the price that was sometimes paid, or avoided, when larger powers decided that certain kinds of knowledge were too valuable to be left behind. In the summer of 1969, when the world watched a rocket rise from a Florida launch pad and carry 3 men toward the moon, few paused to consider the hands that had first shaped the technology now reaching for the stars. Those hands had once swung pickaxes in damp tunnels under a mountain in Germany, and many of them belonged to men who never lived to see what their forced labor helped create. The V-2 rockets that Hans Kammler had helped push into production during the final years of the war carried the dreams of engineers like Wernher von Braun, yet they were assembled under conditions that turned human beings into expendable parts of a machine. In the tunnels of Dora-Mittelbau, prisoners worked in shifts that stretched through the night, their bodies weakened by hunger and the constant damp that seeped through the rock. A young man from Poland, arrested for resistance work and sent first to Auschwitz and then to the tunnels, remembered the way the air tasted of stone dust and explosives. He had once studied engineering in a quiet university town. Now he carried heavy sections of rocket casing on his shoulders while guards shouted orders that left no room for rest. The work itself was precise and unforgiving. A single misaligned component could delay an entire assembly line, and delays meant longer shifts or harsher treatment. The prisoner learned to move carefully, to steady his hands even when exhaustion made every movement feel like a struggle. In those small acts of concentration, he preserved a fragment of the person he had been before the arrests and the transports. There were moments when the prisoners found ways to reach toward one another despite the system designed to isolate them. During a brief pause in one of the assembly areas, an older man who had once taught mathematics in a small German town noticed a younger prisoner struggling with a heavy piece of equipment. Without drawing attention from the guards, the older man shifted his own stance to take some of the weight. The gesture lasted only seconds, but it carried the quiet weight of shared endurance. Later, when they were marched back toward the barracks, the younger man whispered a few words of thanks in broken German. The older man nodded once and said nothing. In a place where every word could be overheard and every kindness could be punished, that single nod became an act of everyday heroism that neither man would ever forget. Von Braun and the team of engineers who had designed the rockets lived in a different layer of the same system. They worked in offices and test sites that were kept separate from the tunnels, yet they could not entirely escape the knowledge of what made rapid production possible. Von Braun had spent years protecting his vision of reaching beyond the atmosphere. He had cultivated relationships with military leaders and navigated political pressures with the same precision he brought to his calculations. When Kammler took control of the program and introduced SS methods of labor management, von Braun found himself in an uneasy partnership. He continued to push for technical improvements and for better conditions for the skilled workers he considered essential. In private conversations with close colleagues, he sometimes spoke of the larger goals that justified the present compromises. The rockets, he believed, could one day serve peaceful exploration rather than wartime destruction. The belief helped him keep working. It did not erase the faces he occasionally glimpsed when he visited the production sites or the reports that crossed his desk describing the human cost of meeting quotas. There were letters that passed between engineers and their families during those final months. One young technician wrote to his wife about long nights spent recalculating trajectories and the hope that the work would soon bring an end to the fighting. He did not describe the tunnels or the conditions under which the rockets were assembled. He focused instead on the engineering challenges that still excited him and on the future he imagined once the war was over. His wife kept those letters in a small box and read them again after the fighting ended. She noticed the gaps in what he had chosen to share. She understood that some truths were too heavy to put into words that might be read by censors or by the man himself when he returned. The letters became a quiet record of what one person had been willing to accept in the name of continuing his work. Kammler himself moved through these years with the same focused attention he had shown since his earliest days in the SS. He reviewed production reports and issued orders to increase output or to move facilities when Allied bombing threatened surface installations. He treated the underground factories as engineering problems that could be solved through better organization and more disciplined labor. The prisoners who died in those tunnels appeared in his calculations only as numbers that required replacement. He did not linger over the personal stories of those who had once been teachers or engineers or farmers. His role was to deliver results, and he approached that role with the same steady determination that had carried him from construction projects in the camps to control of the rocket program. The satisfaction he felt in meeting targets existed alongside the knowledge of what those targets cost. He kept that knowledge contained within the language of efficiency and necessity. When the war ended and the surviving scientists were approached by American recruiters, von Braun and several of his colleagues made the decision to continue their work under new circumstances. They left behind the tunnels and the quotas and the system that had once claimed their expertise. In the United States, they found laboratories and resources that allowed them to pursue the vision of space exploration that had always been part of their thinking. The Saturn V rocket that eventually carried astronauts to the moon drew on principles first tested in the V2 program. The trajectory calculations, the staging techniques, the understanding of how to move large vehicles beyond the atmosphere all carry traces of work that had begun under Kammler's oversight. The engineers who guided the Apollo program rarely spoke of the conditions under which those early principles had been refined. They focused on the technical achievements and on the peaceful purposes those achievements now served. The unacknowledged legacy remained in the background, visible only to those who chose to look closely at the chain of decisions that had made rapid progress possible. There were prisoners who survived the tunnels and who later learned that the rockets they had been forced to assemble had contributed to technology that reached the moon. One survivor, a man who had spent months carrying heavy components while guards watched for any sign of slowing, described the mixture of feelings that came with that knowledge. He felt a quiet pride that something built under such brutal conditions had eventually served a purpose beyond destruction. He also felt the weight of knowing that the pride came at a cost measured in lives lost and bodies broken. He spoke of these feelings only with other survivors, and conversations that took place decades after the war. In those small gatherings, men who had once shared the same barracks and the same exhaustion found ways to acknowledge both the achievement and the price that had been paid to reach it. The families of those who did not survive carried a different kind of legacy. A mother in a small Polish village waited for news of her son long after the fighting had ended. She kept a photograph of him in his university days and sometimes traced the outline of his face with her finger. When she eventually learned that he had died in the tunnels while working on rocket components, she had no way to connect his death to the later images of rockets rising toward the moon. The connection existed only in the larger story of how technical progress and human suffering had been intertwined. She carried her grief without ever knowing the full chain of events that had led from her son's arrest to the launch pads in Florida. Her private sorrow became part of the unacknowledged cost that accompanied the visible triumphs of the space age. Von Braun himself lived with the knowledge of what had been required to reach the point where peaceful exploration became possible. In later years, he spoke often of the future and of the benefits that space travel could bring to humanity. He rarely spoke of the tunnels or of the man who had once controlled the production schedule. When questions arose about the conditions under which the V2 program had operated, he and his colleagues tended to emphasize the technical challenges and the military necessities of the time. The human stories of those who had labored in the tunnels remained largely outside the public narrative. They surfaced in survivor testimonies and in quiet conversations among those who had been there, but they did not appear in the official histories of the space program. The unacknowledged legacy persisted in the gap between what was celebrated and what had been endured. If the hidden human stories behind the technology that carried humanity to the moon have left you wanting to see what the official records and carefully managed narratives never showed, there are collections of raw, uncensored images and footage from that time that reveal the harsh realities behind the uniforms and the production quotas. You can find them through a secure digital product made available for those who want the unfiltered visual record. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The rockets that reached the moon carried with them the accumulated knowledge of engineers who had once worked under impossible pressure and the unacknowledged labor of thousands who had been forced to make that pressure possible. Kammler's role in organizing that labor and in pushing production to meet wartime demands remained largely invisible in the public story of space exploration. His disappearance in the final days of the war allowed the narrative to focus on technical achievement and on the vision of peaceful exploration without requiring a full accounting of the conditions under which the foundational work had been done. The survivors who had lived through those conditions carried their own memories of what had been required. Some of them found ways to speak of both the suffering and the eventual outcome. Others kept their silence, understanding that the world preferred the image of rockets rising cleanly into the sky over the darker image of tunnels where men had died to make those rockets possible. The legacy that Kammler helped create continued to shape the possibilities of space travel long after his own story had faded into uncertainty. It existed in the engineering principles that guided later programs and in the quiet knowledge of those who understood the full chain of decisions that had led from forced labor in a German mountain to a footprint on the lunar surface. That chain remained largely unexamined in the official celebrations of achievement, yet it continued to echo in the personal stories of those who had been closest to the cost. In the quiet that followed the disappearance of Hans Kammler, what remained was not a single clear ending but a scattering of fragments, stories of those who had built and those who had been broken, systems that continued to shape the world long after the man who had helped design them had stepped away from a road in the final days of a collapsing front. He had been a boy who drew careful lines on paper in a port city still carrying the weight of defeat, a young engineer who found purpose in the promise of order after years of uncertainty. A professional who rose by delivering results when others hesitated. Along the way he had learned to measure success in structures completed and quotas met, to treat the human realities attached to those measurements as variables that could be managed or set aside. The camps he helped expand, the tunnels he helped carve beneath a mountain, the rockets assembled under pressure that left bodies broken and spirits tested. These had all been framed as necessary steps toward larger goals. The people who endured them had found their own ways to hold onto fragments of dignity, a shared crust of bread passed between strangers in a work gang, a whispered word of encouragement when guards were not listening, a hidden note that might one day tell someone what had been witnessed. Those small acts of resilience had not stopped the machinery, but they had kept something human alive inside it. Kammler himself had moved through the same years with a growing confidence that his particular skills were exactly what the system required. He had taken control of projects others could not complete on schedule, reorganized labor and resources with an eye for efficiency, and delivered what was asked without the delays that came from too many questions. In the final months, as the ground beneath every plan shifted, he had tried to hold the pieces together, moving personnel, securing documents, issuing orders that still carried the tone of authority even when the authority itself was slipping. The driver who stayed with him until the separation on that contested road later spoke of a man who continued to expect instructions to be followed, who still weighed routes and next steps as if outcomes could still be shaped. That expectation had been part of what made him effective for so long, and it had also been part of what left those around him with incomplete stories when he was no longer there to give the next order. The scientists who had worked alongside him carried their own private reckonings into the years that followed. Some had justified continued involvement by focusing on the technical challenges and the belief that the rockets might one day serve purposes beyond the immediate war. Others had quietly protected what they could, arranging for certain skilled workers to be moved, keeping notes separate from official records, preserving a sense of professional continuity even as the conditions around them grew harsher. After the fighting ended, several of them found new laboratories and new opportunities in places far from the tunnels and the camps. They built lives and reputations around the vision of exploration that had always been part of their thinking. Yet the knowledge of what had been required to reach those new laboratories remained with them, sometimes acknowledged in private conversations, sometimes set aside in favor of the work that still lay ahead. The separation between achievement and cost was never complete, even when it was rarely spoken aloud in public. The families of those who had been forced into the labor that sustained Kammler's projects lived with absences that no official record could fill. A mother who waited for news of a son taken during an arrest, a wife who kept a place at the table long after hope had faded, children who grew up with stories of a parent who had vanished into a system that offered no explanations. These were the quieter consequences that spread outward from every quota and every improvement. The resilience shown by survivors and by those left behind often took the form of simple persistence, continuing to work, to care for others, to speak when speaking became possible. One survivor later described how, years after the tunnels had been abandoned, he still found himself pausing at certain moments to remember the names of men who had shared the same shift and the same exhaustion. Those names were not recorded in any production report. They lived only in the memory of someone who had chosen to carry them forward. What Kammler left behind was not only the physical structures and the technical knowledge that would later feed into other programs. He left a demonstration of how ambition and professional skill could be turned to serve systems that measured human lives in terms of output and replacement. The engineer who had once sought to build things that would last had become part of a machinery that consumed people in order to produce weapons and facilities designed for destruction. That transformation had not required dramatic villainy at every step. It had required a steady willingness to treat the human cost as someone else's concern, to focus on the next solvable problem, to accept that results mattered more than the stories attached to those results. The same pattern had appeared in smaller ways throughout his career, and the early decisions to join organizations that promised order, and the later choices to optimize processes without pausing to ask what the optimized outcome would actually do to the people moving through them. There were moments when individuals inside that system had still chosen differently. A guard who looked away at a critical moment, an engineer who quietly altered a list to spare one more person from immediate danger, a prisoner who risked punishment to pass a piece of bread or a word of encouragement. These acts had not changed the larger direction of events, but they had kept alive the possibility that even under crushing pressure, people could still reach toward one another. The existence of those moments stood as a quiet counter to the logic of efficiency without conscience. They suggested that the human capacity for connection and resistance did not disappear simply because systems were designed to erase it. The questions that linger after Kammler vanished are not only about what happened on that final road or whether he survived in some hidden form. They are questions about how talent and loyalty and the desire to build can be drawn into service of ends that no one would openly choose if the full cost were visible from the beginning. They are questions about the spaces where professional detachment becomes moral distance, where the language of necessity and results crowds out the language of shared humanity. They are questions that do not belong only to one man or one regime. They belong to any setting where skill is valued more highly than the willingness to ask what that skill is being asked to serve. In the years since, the rockets that carried people to the moon and the underground methods that influenced later construction projects have often been discussed as technical achievements. The stories of those who labored and died to make those achievements possible have remained harder to hold in the same frame. Yet the warning embedded in Kammler's path is precisely that the two cannot be fully separated without losing something essential. When the builder vanishes, what remains is the record of what was built and at what cost, carried forward in the memories of survivors and the questions of those who study the fragments, and in the quiet insistence that history is not only a story of structures and outcomes but of the people who moved through them. If these stories of ordinary ambition meeting extraordinary systems, of small resistances persisting inside larger machinery, and of the questions that remain when power and conscience part ways have reminded you how much careful, dedicated work it takes to keep such human truths in view, then you understand why these narratives depend on people who believe in preserving them. If you found value in the way we bring these chapters into clearer light, a small tip, even as little as $1, through Ko-Fi helps support the research and the time that makes such work possible. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. What remains, then, is an invitation to carry forward the habit of asking the question that Kammler's path so often avoided: at what cost? The answer will never be simple, and it will never be finished. It will appear in the choices made by engineers and scientists and ordinary citizens who decide whether skill alone is enough, or whether the stories of those affected by that skill must also be part of the calculation. It will appear in the willingness to remember that behind every blueprint and every quota there were lives being shaped, sometimes broken, sometimes resilient in ways that no system could fully predict. And it will appear in the recognition that when one builder vanishes, the warning he leaves behind is not about a single life but about the ongoing possibility that talent without conscience can still build structures whose true cost becomes visible only after the builder is gone. That possibility does not disappear with any one disappearance. It waits for the next set of careful lines drawn on paper, the next decision to focus on results without pausing to ask who will carry the weight of those results, the next moment when someone chooses to look away or to look more closely. The fragments Kammler left behind are not only historical. They are a standing reminder that the work of asking at what cost belongs to every generation that inherits the systems others have built.